Hello, friend. Welcome to Sleepy Old World. Get comfortable. Before we go anywhere tonight, if these stories have been keeping you company, a like helps more than you would probably guess. And if you want more nights like this one waiting for you whenever you need them, subscribing costs nothing and means a great deal to me. That is the whole pitch. I promise I will not bring it up again tonight. What I would genuinely love to know is where you are listening from right now. Maybe you're somewhere in Texas tonight, the air conditioner running steadily against the heat that has not really let go since noon. Maybe you're in London, the window cracked open just slightly, a small fan turning in the corner, pushing around air that is warmer than it has any right to be at this hour. Drop it in the comments below. I read every single one of them, always. All right, love. Let your shoulders drop, let your hands rest. Let's go. Tonight we are stepping into how the filthy rich really had fun in Gilded Age America, and I promise you, some of what is coming is going to genuinely shock you. And we are not beginning with the part everyone already pictures, the chandeliers, the orchestra tuning up behind a wall of hothouse roses, because that is the version you have already seen 100 times without me. Tonight we are going somewhere smaller first. A dressing room on the second floor of a limestone house on Fifth Avenue, a few minutes before 8 in the evening, in the autumn of 1892. A maid is kneeling on the floor with a box of pins in her lap, and the young woman, standing in front of the mirror, arms slightly raised so her dress can be fastened, is not thinking about the party downstairs at all. She is thinking about a list. Maybe she is someone who married into this world rather than being born to it, and she has not yet stopped doing the math in her head, converting every gown and every course of dinner into what it would have paid for back home. Maybe she is someone who was born to it entirely, who has never once converted anything into anything, because the numbers were never real to her the way they are real to everyone else. Maybe she is simply tired tonight, genuinely tired, and no one downstairs will ever know it, because tired is not a thing a woman in this house is permitted to be in public. Here is the detail I want you to sit with for a moment before we go any further. This house has a name for a room that exists for the sole purpose of storing gowns that will be worn exactly once. It is called nothing so grand as a name suggests. It is just a room, but the room itself, the fact of its existence, tells you almost everything about what is coming tonight. The dress being pinned into place right now cost more than a skilled carpenter would earn in an entire year of steady work. It will be worn for perhaps 5 hours. It will not be worn again, not because it will be damaged, not because it will go out of fashion by tomorrow, but because being seen in the same gown twice, in this particular world, in this particular decade, is a kind of small social wound that a woman in her position simply does not allow to happen. Downstairs, somewhere in the kitchen, a cook and 11 assistants are finishing a dinner that will run to 14 courses. Somewhere in the stable behind the house, a coachman is walking 2 matched greys in slow circles to keep them calm before the carriage ride. And somewhere in New York tonight, on streets not terribly far from this one, men are sleeping in doorways because there is nowhere else for them to go. Both of these things are true at the same time in the same city on the same night. That is the world we're stepping into. I want to be honest with you about something before we start. This is not really a story about greed, or at least it is not only that. It is a story about boredom. Astonishing, cavernous, structural boredom, the kind that only a very particular arrangement of money and idleness and social pressure can produce, and what people do when they are that bored, when they have that much money, and when the entire purpose of their lives is quietly narrowed down to being noticed. What they built to fill that boredom is, frankly, one of the strangest chapters in American history. Dinners for dogs, parties thrown entirely underwater, or close enough to it. Men eating dinner on horseback indoors in formal dress. We're going to get to all of it. But first, let us understand why any of it happened at all. Because the why is stranger than the parties themselves. Here is the thing nobody tells you about the Gilded Age, and it is worth understanding before anything else makes sense. This was not old money behaving badly. Old money in New York in the 1700s and early 1800s was actually fairly restrained, at least by the standards of what came later. The families who had been rich for generations, the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, the older Schuylers, lived well, but they lived within a kind of understood ceiling. You did not flaunt. Flaunting was considered common, the mark of someone who did not know any better. Wealth, in that older world, was supposed to look inherited, unremarkable, almost accidental, the way a person who has always had good teeth does not think much about their teeth. And then, over the span of about 30 years, starting roughly in the 1860s, an entirely new kind of fortune arrived in New York, and it arrived so fast that the old rules simply could not absorb it. Railroads, steel, oil, banking on a scale nobody had seen before. Men who had grown up with almost nothing suddenly controlled sums of money that made the old Knickerbocker families, the ones who had been rich since before the Revolution, look almost modest by comparison. The Vanderbilts are the example everyone reaches for, and for good reason. Cornelius Vanderbilt started as a ferry operator on Staten Island and built a fortune in shipping, and then railroads so enormous that by the time he died in 1877, he was, by some estimates, the wealthiest man in the entire country, wealthier than the federal treasury itself held in reserve. His descendants inherited not just the money, but the problem that came with it. They had more money than anyone in New York society had ever had, and almost nobody in that society would receive them. This is the part that I think genuinely surprises people, because it seems backward. You would think money alone would open every door instantly. It did not. New York society in this period operated under a set of rules that had almost nothing to do with money and almost everything to do with time, specifically how long your family had held the money. This was policed with startling precision by one woman in particular, and if you know only one name from this era, it is probably hers. Carolyn Astor, known to everyone simply as Mrs. Astor, decided more or less single-handedly who counted as society in New York and who did not. Her list, the famous 400, supposedly represented the exact number of people who could comfortably fit in her ballroom, though the number itself became a kind of shorthand for something larger, for the idea that society was a small, closed circle, and everyone outside it, regardless of how many millions they had, was simply not real in the way that mattered. The Vanderbilts, staggeringly rich as they were, spent years locked outside that circle, because their money was new, because it smelled, faintly and permanently, of ferries and freight yards rather than of inherited land. And this is where our first real character enters the story, because one woman decided she was not going to accept that verdict, and the way she fought back changed the entire shape of what wealthy entertainment in America would become for the next 3 decades. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt, and I find myself genuinely admiring her, even though almost nothing about her methods was admirable in any conventional sense. She was sharp, relentless, and completely unsentimental about using spectacle as a weapon. In 1883, she built a house on Fifth Avenue modelled loosely on a French Renaissance chateau, a structure so aggressively grand that it made the older, more restrained mansions nearby look almost embarrassed of themselves. And then she announced she would host a costume ball to celebrate its completion, a ball so elaborate that it would become, within weeks, the single most talked about social event New York had ever seen. Here's the detail that makes the story work, though. Mrs. Astor's daughter wanted an invitation, and Alva Vanderbilt, who understood leverage the way a chess player understands the board, let it be known, through the careful, indirect channels that this world specialized in, that an invitation could not be extended to a family that had never paid a formal call on her. That was the rule. You called first. You acknowledged the household existed before the household would acknowledge yours. Mrs. Astor, the undisputed monarch of old New York, was forced, after weeks of a standoff that the entire city was quietly watching, to send her carriage to the Vanderbilt house and leave her card. It was a small, almost invisible act, and it broke the wall completely. Once Mrs. Astor called, the Vanderbilts were in. Not just in for one party, but in permanently, and the entire architecture of who counted in New York shifted on its foundation. I mention all of this not because the politics of calling cards is inherently thrilling. though I confess there is something almost sporting about watching two immovable forces maneuver around a single social technicality, but because it explains everything that follows tonight. Once the wall between old money and new money cracked, the two groups did not simply merge quietly into one polite society. They began competing. And the currency of that competition was not money itself, because by this point, everyone involved had more money than any single household could reasonably spend. The currency became spectacle. Whoever could throw the most talked about party. Whoever could produce the single detail that made the entire city gasp the next morning over their coffee and their newspaper won that particular round. And once that competition started, there was structurally no ceiling on it at all. That is the engine that produced everything you are about to hear tonight. Let us go back to that ball for a moment, because the details of it are worth lingering on, and because it sets the template for everything that came after. The invitation list ran to roughly 1,200 people, and yet, because of the standoff we just discussed, being invited was treated as though it were the rarest thing in the world. Women began ordering their costumes months in advance, some of them from Worth, the great Paris fashion house that dressed empresses, and the competition to be talked about the next day started long before anyone actually arrived at the house. One young woman attending that night wore a costume built around the theme of electric light, which had only recently arrived in New York in any meaningful public way, and which still felt, to most people experiencing it, faintly miraculous. Her gown was constructed with small battery-powered bulbs sewn into the fabric itself, so that she moved through the ballroom lit from within, a walking demonstration of the newest technology in America stitched directly onto silk. Imagine that for a moment. Gas lamps still flickered in most drawing rooms in New York that year, and here was a young woman glowing, quite literally, at the centre of a ballroom, because her family could afford to have the future sewn into her dress before most of the city had electricity in their homes at all. Other guests came dressed as Mary, Queen of Scots, as figures from the court of Louis XV, as Norse goddesses, as characters from paintings so specific that guessing the reference correctly became its own quiet social sport for the evening. The hostess herself appeared in a costume representing a Venetian princess, heavily jewelled, with a headdress that alone reportedly took a full season to construct. There was a series of formal dances called quadrilles, choreographed group performances rather than ordinary dancing, in which small teams of guests dressed in matching, elaborately coordinated costumes moved through rehearsed patterns for the entertainment of everyone watching. One quadrille was built entirely around a hobby horse theme, dancers dressed as riders in hunting pink, their partners costumed as the horses themselves. Another group performed as an opera bouffe quadrille in exaggerated comic court dress. These were not spontaneous. Guests had been rehearsing for weeks in private drawing rooms, hiring dance masters, coordinating fabric and colour so precisely that the effect when the group finally moved together on the ballroom floor looked less like a party and more like a small, privately funded opera production, performed once and never again. The ball reportedly cost somewhere in the neighbourhood of $250,000, a figure so large for a single evening's entertainment in 1883 that newspapers across the country covered it, not just in New York, but in cities that had no direct connection to any of the families involved at all. Readers in small towns in the Midwest were reading detailed accounts of gowns and quadrilles and the layout of the supper tables, because the story had become, in effect, a kind of early national entertainment in its own right, a glimpse into a world that almost none of the readers would ever come remotely close to touching. And here is the detail that stops me every time I think about it. All of this, the electric gown, the rehearsed quadrilles, the months of preparation, existed for a single night, not a season, not even a week, one evening. By 4 or 5 in the morning, when the last carriages finally pulled away from the house, the costumes went back into trunks, most of them never to be worn again in that exact form, and the enormous temporary structure of the evening simply dissolved, leaving behind nothing but newspaper coverage and the social outcome it had been designed to produce, which, as we discussed, was total. The wall came down, and once it came down there was no reason left for anyone to hold back. Now, let us talk about the dogs, because I promised you dogs, and I intend to deliver. If there is one person who deserves to be understood properly before we go further, it is a woman named Mamie Fish, married to a railroad executive named Stuyvesant Fish, and widely regarded, even by her own social circle, as the most entertaining hostess in New York. Mamie was not interested in the slow, dignified accumulation of prestige that women like Mrs. Astor had spent decades building. She wanted, more than anything, for her parties to be talked about, and she had a genius, a genuine, undeniable genius, for making sure that happened. She once sent out formal invitations announcing a dinner in honor of a visiting prince. Guests arrived in their finest evening dress, curious and slightly nervous about meeting foreign royalty, only to discover, once they were seated, that the guest of honor was a monkey, dressed in a small white tie and tails, seated at the head of the table with the same formal place setting as everyone else. At another of her gatherings, she arranged to have an elephant brought in as a guest, and had dancers feed the animal peanuts throughout the evening while the human guests watched, drinks in hand, in a drawing room never designed to hold anything larger than a piano. But the party that people still talk about, the one that has genuinely earned its reputation, is the dinner she co-hosted with her frequent collaborator, a man named Harry Lair, at her 40-room summer cottage in Newport, in honor of a friend's dog's birthday. And I want to walk you through this slowly, because the details deserve it. 100 guests arrived that evening, each bringing a dog, not leaving the dog at home with a servant, bringing the dog, dressed for the occasion, some in small jeweled collars, one of them reportedly worth $15,000, a sum that in that period would have paid a working family's expenses for close to 20 years. The humans dined in one room, on a full formal meal befitting the setting. In a separate room, an entire second dining setup had been arranged specifically for the dogs, complete with small individual place settings, where the animals were served a 3-course meal of their own, stewed liver, rice, biscuits and bones arranged with the same care a chef would give a human banquet. At least one dog, according to the accounts that survive, ate so much that it simply passed out at the table and had to be carried home by its embarrassed owner. The whole affair reportedly cost somewhere near $50,000 for a single evening, built entirely around celebrating the birthday of an animal that would have no memory of the occasion by the following week. I find myself laughing every time I picture it, and also, if I am honest, feeling something close to bewilderment. There is something almost admirable about the sheer commitment to the bit. Nobody involved seemed embarrassed. Nobody seemed to think this required justification. It was simply what an afternoon could become, if you had enough money and enough boredom, and a hostess willing to turn both into spectacle. Here is the detail that I think explains Mamie Fish better than any other. She used to greet her arriving guests with a particular line, something to the effect of telling them to make themselves completely at home, and that no one wished them there more sincerely than she did, delivered in a voice loud enough that everyone nearby understood it was, at least partly, a joke at the guest's expense, and at her own. She had a reputation for a sharp tongue, for insults delivered with such warmth and confidence that people came back for more of them, almost as a form of social entertainment in itself. Being mocked by Mamie Fish at one of her own parties became, strangely, a kind of status symbol. It meant you had been noticed. It meant you mattered enough to be teased. Let us slow down here for a moment, because I want to bring you back to that young woman from the beginning of our story, the one standing in front of her mirror while her maid finished the last of the pins. Maybe tonight is the night she attends the single most talked about and most criticized party of the entire era. Because in February of 1897, a couple named Bradley and Cornelia Martin decided to host a costume ball at the newly built Waldorf Hotel on a scale that would eclipse everything that had come before it, including the Vanderbilt ball we discussed earlier. And the timing could not have been worse, or, depending on how you look at it, could not have been more perfectly, tragically on brand for the era. The country at that point was still climbing out of a brutal economic depression that had begun with a financial panic in 1893. Unemployment in many cities had climbed past 20%. Families were going hungry in numbers that made the newspapers regularly alongside the society pages. And into that environment, Cornelia Martin announced a ball so extravagant that it would eventually cost close to $400,000, a figure that, translated into today's money, runs close to $10 million for one single night. Here is the detail I find almost unbearably strange. Cornelia Martin's stated justification, offered publicly and apparently sincerely, was that the ball would help the economy. The logic went something like this. If wealthy New Yorkers spent enormous sums on costumes, seamstresses and tailors and florists across the city would be employed, wages would flow downward, and the depression would ease, at least locally, at least a little. There is something almost touching about how earnestly this argument was made, and something almost grotesque about how completely it missed the actual feeling of watching several hundred of the richest people in America dress as European royalty, while you yourself were struggling to feed your children. The invitations specified that guests were to appear as figures from the 16th, 17th, or 18th century, and they were sent out on relatively short notice specifically so that guests would have no choice but to have their costumes made locally, in New York, rather than ordering from Paris. Whether this actually helped anyone in any meaningful, lasting way is a question historians still debate. What is not in debate is what the ball itself looked like. The ballroom at the Waldorf was transformed, at enormous expense, into a near replica of the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, the actual French royal palace, gilded and mirrored, and lit with what one account describes as a truly staggering quantity of candles and electric light combined. Roughly 800 guests attended, each in a historical costume that, on average, cost something in the neighborhood of $11,000, a sum that many working families of the era would not see across several years of labor. Cornelia Martin herself appeared as Mary, Queen of Scots, in a gown with a 20-foot train, wearing jewels that had once, reportedly, belonged to the French King Louis XIV. Caroline Astor, our old friend from the beginning of the story, arrived in jewels alone, valued at roughly $200,000, worn simply as accessories for a single evening. One guest appeared in a full suit of armor that alone cost $10,000 to construct, which meant that a man spent on a single costume, worn for one evening, for the sole purpose of standing in a rented ballroom, a sum that could have purchased an entire house in most American cities at the time. The supper that night ran to 28 courses. Party favors were distributed to guests as they left, jewelry for the women and for the men, cigars individually wrapped in genuine $100 bills, which guests could either smoke, destroying the bill entirely, or unwrap and pocket, which many apparently chose to do, treating the cigar itself as a mere wrapper for the actual gift. I want you to picture that for a moment. A man standing in a hallway at the end of the evening, gently unrolling a cigar to retrieve a $100 bill from inside it, in a country where, that same winter, newspapers were running stories about soup kitchens running out of soup. Once the details reached the newspapers, the public reaction was not admiration, it was fury. Members of the clergy denounced the ball from their pulpits the following Sunday. One reportedly stood before his congregation and pointed out that the very people criticizing him for asking for donations to the poor were the same people preparing to spend fortunes dressing as dead French aristocrats. Editorial pages across the city ran furious columns. Threatening letters arrived at the Martin household in the weeks leading up to the event, some from people identifying themselves with anarchist movements that were, in that period, a genuine and frightening force in American cities. The windows of the Waldorf ballroom had to be boarded up on the night of the ball itself, out of real, credible fear that someone might throw an explosive device through the glass and into the crowd of jeweled, costumed guests. Even so, the ball went forward. It was, by the standards of the people attending it, an enormous success, the kind of evening people would discuss for years, and it was also, in a very real sense, the beginning of the end for that particular style of unguarded, unapologetic public excess. Within a few years, the Bradley Martins had relocated permanently to England, in part because the social and financial fallout in New York had become too uncomfortable to continue living with. The Bradley Martin Ball is remembered now, by most historians of the period, as something close to the last great unself-conscious gesture of Gilded Age extravagance, the moment right before the mood of the country started to shift, before muckraking journalists and progressive reformers began building the case, piece by piece, that this kind of spending, however dazzling, could not continue indefinitely without consequence. And here is the part nobody talks about. the strange coda that came 6 years later, as if the era wanted one final absurd flourish before it truly ended. In March of 1903, a wealthy industrialist named Cornelius Kingsley Garrison Billings, known to almost everyone simply by his initials, decided to celebrate the completion of a new private stable he had built on the edge of Manhattan, a stable so lavish it had cost $200,000 on its own, with brass nameplates for each individual horse and residential suites for guests upstairs. Billings loved two things above all else in life: fine dining and horses, and rather than choose between them, he decided quite simply to combine them. He planned to host the dinner directly at the new stable, but reporters had gotten wind of the story and camped outside the property for days trying to get details, and Billings, wanting to avoid the spectacle turning into an uncontrolled press circus, quietly switched the location at the last minute to the Grand Ballroom of Sherry's, then the most fashionable restaurant in New York, occupying an entire ornate building on Fifth Avenue. Guests arrived on the evening of March 28th in full formal evening dress, tuxedos and gowns, expecting reasonably a conventional dinner. What they found instead, when they stepped into the fourth-floor ballroom, was a room that had been completely transformed over 3 days of round-the-clock labor by roughly 24 workers into something resembling an English countryside scene. Real turf had been laid across the floor. Trees and shrubbery had been brought in and arranged along the walls. A false harvest moon hung suspended from the ceiling. Live birds had been released into the space to add motion and sound. There were no chairs. There were no tables, not in the conventional sense. Instead, 36 horses, gentle, well-trained animals rented specifically for the occasion from local riding academies, had been brought up to the 4th floor by freight elevator and stood waiting in the transformed ballroom, each one fitted with a specially built silver dining tray attached directly to the saddle. Guests mounted the horses in full evening dress, arranged themselves into a large circle facing inward toward each other, and proceeded to eat an elaborate multi-course dinner while seated on horseback, indoors, 4 floors above street level, in one of the most exclusive restaurants in the country. Each horse had its own dedicated attendant, dressed as a groom in scarlet coat and white breeches, standing at its head throughout the meal to keep the animal calm and steady, because the last thing anyone wanted was a spooked horse and an overturned tray of expensive food 4 floors up. Champagne was not poured into glasses in any conventional way. Instead, bottles of iced champagne were tucked into the saddlebags themselves, and guests sipped directly from rubber tubing that ran up from the bottles, so that a man could eat his dinner off a tray bolted to his saddle and drink his champagne through a straw, all while sitting on a horse that had, until that morning, been pulling a cab or standing in a stable somewhere in Manhattan with no idea it was about to become part of the most talked-about dinner party of the year. The total cost of the evening ran to roughly $50,000 for 36 guests, which, if you do the arithmetic, works out to something in the neighborhood of $1,400 per person, in $1,897 for a single dinner. A newspaper photographer had been hired specifically to document the event, and the resulting images, men in white tie and tails seated stiffly on horseback around silver trays, became some of the most reproduced photographs of the entire Gilded Age, still circulated today whenever anyone wants a single image that captures the sheer, almost theatrical strangeness of how the very rich chose to entertain themselves in this period. One later writer, reflecting on the photographs, joked that they reinforced a popular belief that New York socialites of this era essentially went to bed in full evening dress, having brushed their teeth with champagne. It is a joke, but it is not entirely unfair. I want to pause here and just sit with something for a second, because I think it is easy to hear these stories back to back and simply laugh, and the laughter is fair, genuinely. Some of this is very funny, but there is also something worth noticing underneath it. Every single one of these parties, the dogs, the monkey, the elephant, the Versailles ballroom, the horses indoors, required an enormous, largely invisible amount of human labor to execute. Someone had to source 36 calm horses and get them comfortable enough to stand still in an unfamiliar, elevator-delivered room for hours. Someone had to lay real turf across a ballroom floor and remove it afterward. Someone had to hand-stitch tiny jeweled collars, cook a 3-course meal for dogs, iron 28 courses worth of linens for 800 guests. The spectacle that made the newspapers was always, underneath it, an enormous logistical operation carried out by people whose names never appeared in any account of the evening at all. That is not the focus of tonight's story, but it is worth remembering as we go, because it is always there, just beneath the surface of every single one of these evenings. I want to shift focus now, because entertainment in this world was not only about dinners and dances, there was a deeper game running underneath all of it, one that the balls and the calling cards and the endless rounds of dressing and undressing were, in many ways, simply the visible surface of, and that game was marriage, specifically whom a young woman would marry, and what that marriage would purchase for her family, if not always for her. Let us return one more time to Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who forced her way into society with that ferociously well-timed calling card in 1883. By the 1890s, Alva had a daughter of her own, a young woman named Consuelo, tall, elegant, swan-necked, genuinely beautiful by every account that survives, and, more importantly for Alva's purposes, genuinely rich. And Alva had decided years in advance, with the same strategic clarity she had once used to break open Mrs. Astor's ballroom, exactly whom her daughter was going to marry. Not who her daughter loved, who her daughter was going to marry. Consuelo, it turned out, had fallen in love on her own with a young American man from an old, respected New York family, someone who would have been, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly appropriate match. Alva did not agree. Alva wanted a title. Specifically, she had set her sights on a young English aristocrat named Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough, a man whose family held one of the grandest private houses in England, a palace called Blenheim, and whose family fortune, despite the grandeur of the house itself, had been quietly and steadily crumbling for a generation. He needed money. Alva had money. Consuelo, whether she liked it or not, was the mechanism by which those two facts would be joined together. What happened next is documented well enough, through letters and later memoirs, that we do not need to guess at the emotional temperature of it. Consuelo resisted. She was, by her own later account, secretly engaged to the young man she actually loved, and she reportedly threatened to elope rather than accept her mother's plan. Alva's response, according to accounts that Consuelo herself later gave, was to essentially imprison her daughter in the family home, restricting her movement and her correspondence, and to threaten in turn that she herself would suffer a fatal collapse of health if Consuelo continued to refuse. Whether that threat was genuine or theatrical hardly mattered. It worked. Consuelo relented. On the 6th of November, 1895, Consuelo Vanderbilt walked down the aisle of a church in New York in a wedding gown her mother had selected, beside bridesmaids her mother had chosen, to marry a man she barely knew, in front of a congregation that included some of the most powerful people in the country. And here is the detail that has survived in nearly every account of that day, repeated by guest after guest, reporter after reporter. It was immediately visibly obvious to everyone in that church that the bride had been crying, not softly, not in some delicate, poetic, storybook way. She arrived at her own wedding with her eyes clearly, unmistakably red, in front of the assembled cream of New York, and, soon after, the assembled cream of England, and the marriage went forward exactly as her mother had designed it. The Duke, for his part, was reportedly just as candid, in private, about his own motivations. He needed Consuelo's dowry to keep his family's estate from financial ruin, and made little secret of it once the marriage had already been secured. The two of them settled into a partnership that was, by most accounts, a genuine functioning working arrangement, two people managing a shared household and producing the required heirs, an heir and what the aristocracy of the period rather coldly called the spare, but it was never, by any account either of them left behind, a marriage built on affection. They separated after roughly a decade. The marriage was eventually annulled, at both of their requests, years later. I bring all of this up because Consuelo was not an isolated case. She was, in fact, one of the earliest and most famous examples of a phenomenon that had, by the 1890s, become something close to an industry. Wealthy American families, flush with new industrial fortunes but still lacking the one thing money could not directly purchase, aristocratic legitimacy, began sending their daughters to London for the social season with the explicit, openly discussed goal of marrying them into titled but cash-poor English and European families. These young women became known, at the time and in the history books since, as dollar princesses. Some of them found genuine happiness in these arranged unions, many did not. But the pattern was remarkably consistent. American money flowed across the Atlantic to prop up crumbling castles and unpayable debts, and in exchange, American families received something that no railroad fortune, however enormous, could otherwise buy them: a title, a coronet, a place in a social order older than their own country. It is worth noticing, quietly, without making too much of it, that the same women who spent their evenings at dinners built entirely around amusement, the dog parties and the horseback rides, and the underwater ballrooms we will get to shortly, were in many cases also living inside marriages that had been arranged with the same cold, transactional logic as a corporate merger. The fun, when you look closely, often existed right alongside a kind of quiet, permanent unhappiness that nobody at the party would ever have mentioned out loud. Let us go to the opera for a moment, because I think it is one of the most revealing entertainments of the entire era, precisely because almost nobody attending was actually there for the opera itself. Picture the Metropolitan Opera House on a Monday evening in the 1890s, the most fashionable night of the week to be seen there. The building holds thousands of people, but the part of the house that matters, socially, the part every newspaper column and every gossiping guest is actually watching, is a curved row of private boxes at the front of the first tier, arranged in a shape that gave the section its permanent nickname. They called it the Diamond Horseshoe, and the name was not a metaphor. It came from the literal blaze of jewelry worn by the women seated in it, so much of it, so concentrated in one curved section of the building, that from certain angles in the auditorium the boxes genuinely seemed to glitter. Here is a detail I find quietly funny. Caroline Astor, our recurring monarch of old New York, liked to claim that the Diamond Horseshoe had actually been named after one specific necklace she owned, a piece with roughly 200 individual diamonds set into it. Historians have never been able to confirm this. It does not really matter whether it is true. What matters is that she wanted people to believe it, which tells you something about how these women thought of themselves in relation to a public space like this one. The opera house was not, first and foremost, a place to hear music, though plenty of genuinely excellent music was performed there. It was a stage with two audiences facing each other, the performers on one side and the entire fashionable population of New York, arranged in tiers of visibility, on the other, each family's box a small, permanently rented advertisement for exactly where that family stood in the social order. The performance itself was, in a very real sense, secondary. Guests arrived deliberately late, sometimes not until the second act had already begun, because arriving on time suggested you had nothing better to do beforehand, and arriving fashionably late allowed for a small dramatic entrance, the door of the box opening, a rustle of silk, a pause while the audience below noted who had just arrived and in what jewels. During the intermissions, the real business of the evening began. Guests moved between boxes, made introductions, assessed unmarried daughters and unmarried sons who happened to be standing at the right moment in the right doorway. Biographers of the era have noted, with a kind of dry amusement, that even Caroline Astor, so publicly devoted to the idea that a woman's highest achievement was elegant restraint, was not above using her own opera box as a fairly transparent marriage market for her 4 daughters and her 1 son, seating them prominently, evening after evening, in full view of every eligible family in the building. I want to describe the sound of the place for a moment, because it is easy to lose the sensory reality of it under all this social analysis. Picture the low hum of hundreds of overlapping conversations continuing quietly through even the loudest orchestral passages, because for many people in those boxes, the orchestra was simply background music for the actual performance, which was social. Picture the particular rustle of silk and taffeta as women shifted in their seats, opened and closed their fans, the small metallic click of opera glasses being raised, not toward the stage, but sideways, toward a neighboring box, to get a clearer look at what someone new was wearing. Picture the warm, slightly overheated air of a packed auditorium, lit by both gas and, in later years, the newly installed electric lighting, a combination that gave the whole house a strange layered glow, part old-world flicker, part startling modern brightness. It must have been on some level genuinely beautiful. It must also have been for the singers on stage pouring real effort into a 4-hour Wagner opera, more than a little strange to perform for a room where half the audience was watching each other instead. Every summer, the whole apparatus of New York society packed itself up and moved north to a small coastal town in Rhode Island called Newport. And I want to be precise about the word these families used for the houses they built there, because the word itself is one of the great jokes of the entire era. They called them cottages. Marble House, the summer residence Alva Vanderbilt's husband built for her 39th birthday, contains 50 rooms and required roughly 500,000 cubic feet of marble to construct, at a total cost of somewhere around $11 million in the money of the period. The Breakers, built a few years later for Alva's brother-in-law, runs to well over 100,000 square feet. These were not cottages by any definition a normal person would recognize. They were palaces, built along a few miles of oceanfront cliff, standing shoulder to shoulder in a kind of architectural arms race that lasted roughly 3 decades, each family trying to outbuild the one next door. For about 6 weeks every summer, Newport became the single most concentrated collection of enormous private wealth anywhere on the American continent, and the entertainments there took on a slightly different character than the ones in New York, because the setting itself was different. There was ocean, there was lawn, acres of it, manicured down to the blade, and so alongside the indoor dinners and the ballroom dances, Newport summers were built around a whole vocabulary of outdoor amusement that the city simply did not allow for. Lawn parties, held on the vast grassy terraces behind these cliffside houses, with small orchestras playing under canvas awnings and guests strolling between flower beds that had been redesigned at enormous expense every single season. Garden parties centered around elaborate floral displays, sometimes built around a single imported flower species that a hostess had decided that year was going to be her signature. There was tennis, still a relatively new sport for polite society in this period, played on private courts behind several of the largest houses, with women competing in long white skirts that would strike a modern player as almost comically impractical. There was sailing, and we will spend real time on the yachts a little later because they deserve their own chapter of this story, and there was a particular Newport ritual worth pausing on, the clam bake, which had originally been a modest communal New England tradition, clams and corn and potatoes cooked together over hot stones on the beach, and which the wealthy families arriving in Newport took and reshaped, almost unrecognizably, into something else entirely. A Newport clam bake hosted by one of these families might still nominally involve clams cooked in the traditional method, but it would also involve uniformed staff, printed menus, imported champagne chilling in silver buckets buried in the sand, and a guest list assembled with exactly the same social precision as any indoor ball. The original humble form of the meal survived only as a kind of decorative gesture, a nod to New England authenticity performed by people who had never once in their entire lives needed to actually dig their own clams. I find something genuinely poignant in that detail, if I am honest. An entire regional tradition, born out of necessity and community and modest means, absorbed and restaged by people with more money than they could ever spend, turned into another occasion for silver buckets and printed menus. It happened over and over across this era, in ways large and small. Whatever ordinary people did to get by, whatever rituals grew naturally out of scarcity and shared effort, the very rich eventually noticed, found charming, and quietly took for their own amusement, stripped of the necessity that had made it meaningful in the first place. Let us go back, for a moment, to that dressing room we started in, because I think it is time to talk properly about the clothes themselves, since clothing in this world was not simply something you wore. It was closer to a language, and a woman who did not speak it fluently paid for the mistake socially in ways that could be surprisingly lasting. The single most important name in that language, for most of the 1880s and 90s, was not American at all. It belonged to an Englishman living in Paris named Charles Frederick Worth, who is generally credited as the first true couturier in the modern sense, the first designer to treat himself not as a tradesman executing a client's instructions, but as an artist whose name alone conferred status on whoever wore his work. A gown from the house of worth was not simply purchased. It was, in the wealthiest circles, closer to being commissioned, the client traveling to Paris, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, to be fitted and consulted and shown fabric samples in a process that could feel, by several contemporary accounts, almost like an audience with a foreign dignitary. Worth dressed empresses. He dressed the wife of Napoleon III, and by extension, owning a Worth gown allowed an American woman, however new her family's money might be, to claim a small tangible connection to European royalty, stitched directly into silk she could actually touch. The gowns themselves were built from fabrics that most people alive today have simply never encountered in daily life. Heavy silk fall that held its shape almost architecturally, velvet so dense it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, delicate hand-worked lace, sometimes generations old, inherited and reincorporated into new dresses, a small thread of family history stitched into the newest fashion. And the ornamentation went well beyond fabric, seed pearls sewn individually across an entire bodice, metallic thread embroidery that could take a single seamstress weeks to complete on one panel of skirt. Some gowns incorporated real gemstones directly into the beading, so that a woman's dress was not merely expensive in the abstract, accounting sense that a modern person might use the word. It was literally, physically, load-bearing wealth, jewels sewn into cloth and worn as casually as a hem. And here, I think, is the detail worth sitting with the longest. As we discussed earlier tonight, a gown of this kind, representing perhaps a full year or more of a skilled worker's total wages, might be worn exactly once. Not because it wore out, not because it went out of style within a single evening, but because a woman of real social standing in this world simply did not appear twice, in the same social season, in the same gown, in front of the same circle of people who would notice and quietly, permanently remember. Some households, particularly the wealthiest, maintained what amounted to an entire archive of these single-use garments, a dedicated storage room, sometimes climate-controlled by the standards of the day, where gowns worn once were kept, catalogued and essentially retired, never to be worn again by the woman who had commissioned them, occasionally passed down or given away to a relative in a different city where the gown had not yet been seen. I find this detail genuinely staggering every time I think about it. An entire room in a house, existing purely to store clothing that will never be worn again, clothing that in almost any other context in American history would have represented an entire family's yearly survival. Now, let me tell you about the German, because it is one of those details that sounds, on first hearing, like it must be a joke, and is not. The German, sometimes called the cotillion, was the final extended dance of a formal ball, and by the 1890s in New York it had evolved into something considerably stranger and more elaborate than a simple dance. It could run for well over an hour, sometimes closer to 2, built around an ever-changing series of figures, small choreographed games really, led by a designated conductor whose job was part choreographer, part master of ceremonies, part social engineer, deciding who would be paired with whom for each new round. One man in particular became so associated with leading the German that it was for a stretch of years essentially considered his professional specialty within society. The same Harry Lehr who co-hosted that dog birthday party with Mammy Fish. Lehr had a genuine gift for it, choreographing elaborate sequences that required weeks of advanced planning, and for turning what had once been a simple concluding dance into the single most anticipated part of an entire evening. And the reason it became so anticipated was the favors at a properly staged German. Favors were not the small paper trinkets you might picture from a modern party. They were genuine, substantial gifts, distributed to guests throughout the various figures of the dance, sometimes small enough to be worn immediately, a jeweled pin, a miniature fan with a mother-of-pearl handle, a tiny gold trinket on a ribbon, and sometimes, at the more extravagant balls, considerably more valuable than that. Hostesses competed, quietly but very seriously, over the quality and originality of their German favors, ordering custom pieces from jewelers months in advance, sometimes themed to match the specific decoration of that evening's ball. A guest attending a well-hosted German might leave the party, by the end of the night, having accumulated a small collection of genuinely valuable objects simply for having participated correctly in a series of dance figures. I want to pause on the strangeness of that for a second, because it is easy to let it slide past as just another extravagant detail among many. Think about what it actually meant, structurally. A dance, an activity that costs nothing to perform, that requires only music and a floor and willing partners, had been transformed into an occasion for one of the wealthiest women in a room to physically hand out jewelry to her guests over the course of an evening, as a demonstration of just how little that jewelry actually cost her, relative to what she had. It was generosity performed as spectacle, gift-giving turned into a form of quiet, glittering boasting, and everyone in the room understood the game perfectly and played along and admired whoever played it best. Stay with me a moment longer, because I want to take you out onto the water now, since so much of this entertainment eventually drifted, quite literally, offshore. The steam yacht was in many ways the ultimate expression of Gilded Age leisure, because unlike a house, however enormous, a yacht was mobile wealth, a floating demonstration that its owner could recreate the comforts of a Fifth Avenue mansion anywhere on the open ocean, staffed and provisioned and moving under his own private power. William Kissam Vanderbilt, the same family we keep returning to tonight, commissioned a steam yacht in the early 1890s called the Valiant, over 300 feet long, at that point the largest and most luxurious private yacht in the entire world. It required a crew of 62 people simply to operate, 32 of them working below decks in the engine room alone, feeding coal and monitoring the great steam engines that could push the vessel through open water at better than 17 knots. 20 more crew handled the sailing and deck operations, and a final 10 staffed the kitchens and staterooms, preparing meals and turning down beds exactly as they might have in a great house on land, except now the house itself was capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean under its own power. The interiors of these vessels were, by every surviving account, staggering. Parisian design studios were hired to furnish staterooms in carved walnut and mahogany, hung with French silk, appointed with library shelving and marble bathrooms, so that stepping below decks felt less like entering a boat and more like stepping into a townhouse that happened to be gently rolling with the swell of the sea. One publisher of the period, a man named James Gordon Bennett, commissioned a yacht with a suite on each of its 3 decks, its own Turkish bath, and room to house a full 100 crew members. He reportedly kept a live cow aboard, housed in a specially padded and ventilated stall below decks, so that his guests could be served genuinely fresh milk each morning in the middle of the open Atlantic, an arrangement that required someone somewhere on that ship to be entirely responsible for the well-being of a single cow living several decks below the waterline. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think it tells you something true about the psychology of this entire era better than almost any other detail tonight. It was not enough for a man like Bennett to simply have fresh milk brought aboard in ice, which any reasonably wealthy person could have arranged easily enough. He needed the actual cow. He needed the entire apparatus of a working dairy operation, shrunk down and relocated into the hold of an ocean-going vessel, purely so that the milk in his coffee could be, in the most literal sense possible, as fresh as if he had never left dry land at all. That is the difference, I think, between ordinary wealth and the specific, almost compulsive perfectionism of Gilded Age wealth. It was never really about comfort. It was about eliminating every last visible seam between the life you lived on land and the life you continued, uninterrupted, at sea, no matter what absurd expensive machinery that elimination required. These yachts anchored off Newport during the summer season, adding their own tall masts and gleaming white hulls to the view from the cliffside lawns, and hosting their own dinners and dances afloat, guests ferried out by smaller launch boats in evening dress, arriving at a party that was, quite literally, floating just offshore from the party they had left on land an hour earlier. The America's Cup races, held in these same waters, became another occasion for the same competitive display, wealthy owners commissioning custom racing yachts purely for the sport of it, spending fortunes on hull design and sail engineering for a competition that offered no prize beyond prestige itself, which by this point in our story you have probably realized was always, in the end, the only prize that actually mattered to anyone in this world. Let us come back to dry land, and back to food, because I have not yet told you about the swans, and I think you will want to hear about the Swans. If Sherry's was the restaurant where the horses went upstairs, Delmonico's was, for most of the 1800s, the reigning temple of extravagant New York dining, the place where a family with new money went specifically to prove, through the sheer scale of a single dinner, that they belonged in the conversation. And in 1873, a wealthy importer named Edward Luckmeyer hosted a dinner there for 75 guests that has gone down in the folklore of the era simply as the Swan Dinner. At the center of an enormous oval table, the staff at Delmonico's constructed an entire miniature landscape, a small artificial lake complete with tiny waterfalls, exotic potted plants standing in for trees, small constructed hillocks and glades built directly onto the table's surface. And swimming across that miniature lake, contained within a mesh of gold wire specially made by Tiffany, were several live swans, brought in for the sole purpose of drifting elegantly across a dinner table while 75 guests ate around them. Now, here is the detail that makes this story genuinely wonderful rather than simply extravagant. At some point during the evening, the swans, being actual living animals rather than decorative props with any understanding of the social stakes involved, got into some kind of altercation with each other right there on the table in front of the assembled guests. The staff, thankfully, had positioned an embankment of flowers along the edges of the miniature lake specifically to shield the diners from any resulting splashes, a detail that tells you the possibility of exactly this kind of chaos had been anticipated, planned for, and budgeted around in advance. This was not an isolated flourish. Delmonico's specialized, across this era, in dinners built around a single overwhelming visual conceit. One yachtsman, hosting a dinner for 10 guests, had a miniature yacht placed at every single seat, each one floating in its own cut-glass basin from Tiffany, complete with satin sails and silk halyards, purely as a centerpiece for a meal that cost, altogether, roughly $400 per plate. In 1800s money, a sum that would have covered a working family's rent for the better part of a year, spent on a single evening's dinner decoration alone. Another dinner, hosted by a visiting Englishman for a group of tea and coffee merchants, sat 100 guests on silk cushions and handed them menus printed in gold leaf directly onto satin fabric, while a full symphony orchestra played, concealed behind a screen of potted palms, so that the music seemed to emerge from nowhere in particular, simply part of the room's atmosphere. That single evening reportedly ran to $20,000. What strikes me hearing these stories back to back is how consistently the imagination on display runs toward the theatrical rather than the merely expensive. Anyone with enough money can serve rare wine or imported delicacies. These hosts wanted something closer to a stage production, a scene that guests would describe to other people for years afterward, competing not just on cost, but on sheer inventiveness, on whether anyone had ever seen anything quite like this particular table before. And in a strange way, I think that impulse, the desire to create something genuinely surprising rather than simply costly, is the one part of all this excess that I find myself almost admiring, even while everything else about it, the swans nearly fighting on a table set for 75 people while children starved a few blocks away, sits far less comfortably. Let us talk about the debutante season now, because underneath all the spectacle we have covered so far, there was a very specific machine running, and that machine existed to produce marriages the way a factory exists to produce goods, however elegantly that factory disguised its actual purpose. A young woman in this world came out into society at roughly 17 or 18 years old, in a formal debut that announced to everyone who mattered that she was now eligible, now available, now on the market. Though of course nobody in this world would ever have used that particular word out loud, the debut itself typically took the form of a ball, sometimes hosted by the girl's own family, sometimes as part of a larger, more established annual event. Caroline Astor hosted an event every January that came to be known as the Patriarch's Ball, organized in cooperation with a small group of powerful men, the self-appointed patriarchs of society, who together controlled the guest list for what was, for years, the single most important social event of the New York winter season. An invitation to the Patriarch's Ball meant something specific and unambiguous. It meant you, or your daughter, had been formally recognized as belonging to that closed circle Mrs. Astor had spent her whole adult life curating and protecting, the same circle whose supposed capacity, as we discussed earlier, gave rise to the famous figure of the 400. A young woman making her debut spent the preceding months, sometimes the preceding year, in careful preparation. Dancing masters were engaged to ensure she could move through a formal quadrille without a single misstep. Deportment instructors corrected the smallest details of posture, the precise angle at which a fan should be held, the exact depth of a curtsy owed to a woman of higher social rank versus one merely of equal standing. Her wardrobe for the season was planned with the same strategic precision as a military campaign, a specific gown for each of perhaps 30 or 40 events across a single winter, morning calls and afternoon teas and evening balls, each requiring its own correct level of formality, its own correct fabric, its own correct degree of visible expense, never so plain that it suggested the family lacked means, never so ostentatious that it suggested the family lacked taste, a needle threaded so finely that entire advice manuals existed purely to help mothers guide their daughters safely through it, and underneath every single one of these carefully calibrated evenings sat the same unspoken calculation: who was watching, whose son might be watching, what that son's family controlled, in railroads or steel or banking, and whether a match between the two families would consolidate fortune or elevate social standing, or both at once. Love, when it appeared in these arrangements, appeared almost as a fortunate accident, a pleasant bonus if it happened to align with a match that made sense on every other level. When it did not align, as we saw so clearly with Consuelo Vanderbilt, it was, with a kind of chilling consistency, simply set aside. Even childhood, in the wealthiest of these New York households, was staged with a similar level of theatrical extravagance, and I think it is worth spending a few minutes here because the entertainments built around children reveal something particularly honest about how this world understood the purpose of spectacle. It was never really about the children's own enjoyment, not primarily. It was about what the event demonstrated to every other adult in the room. Children's balls were a genuine feature of the winter social calendar, miniature versions of the adult events we have already discussed, complete with formal invitations, small orchestras scaled appropriately for smaller feet, and elaborate refreshments arranged at a height a child could actually reach. Young girls attended in gowns that mirrored, in miniature, the same silhouettes their mothers wore, sometimes commissioned from the very same dressmakers. Young boys wore small formal suits, sometimes with tiny versions of the tailcoats their fathers would put on that same evening for an entirely separate adult gathering happening later in the same house. Birthday parties for the children of the wealthiest families could rival, in scale and expense, entire weddings in less rarefied circles. One well-documented party built its entire theme around a doll collection, guests arriving to find the family's ballroom transformed into what amounted to a life-sized dollhouse, with place settings and favors, and even, in some versions of the story, servants dressed to resemble oversized toys, moving among the child guests as living decoration for the afternoon. Ponies and small pony carts were a genuinely common feature of these events, animals trained specifically to be gentle enough for young children to handle, brought onto private lawns so that a birthday celebration might include actual rides, a miniature stable's worth of animals assembled and then dispersed again after a single afternoon. Perhaps the detail that says the most, though, is the dollhouse itself, which in several of the wealthiest households was not a toy in any ordinary sense of the word, but a genuine architectural commission, built by real craftsmen, wired for actual working electric lighting, years before most American homes had electricity installed at all, furnished with miniature versions of real antique furniture, sometimes scaled precisely to match rooms in the family's actual house. A single such dollhouse could cost more to construct than an entire modest family home elsewhere in the country, existing purely so that a child of 6 or 7 could arrange tiny furniture inside tiny rooms, an entire skilled workshop's labor compressed down into an object that would, within a few years, be quietly retired to a nursery shelf and largely forgotten. I do not say any of this to suggest these children were somehow villains. Obviously, they were simply children, absorbing without question the only version of childhood they had ever known. But there is something worth noticing in how completely, how thoroughly, the logic of display had saturated every single layer of this world. right down to a birthday party for a 7-year-old. Even play in this particular slice of American history had somehow become a performance for an adult audience. Let us return, for a moment, to the young woman we began with tonight, the one standing in front of her mirror while her maid finished the last few pins. By now her dress is fastened, her hair is arranged, and she has come downstairs to find her husband waiting in the front hall, dressed and ready, glancing at his pocket watch with the mild, practiced impatience of a man who has done this hundreds of times before. Maybe she still feels that faint flutter of nerves she has never quite managed to outgrow, even after several full seasons of exactly this kind of evening. Maybe, by now she has grown almost entirely numb to it, the way anyone grows numb to a routine repeated often enough, however extraordinary that routine would look to an outside observer. The carriage ride to tonight's event carries them only a few blocks, because in this particular slice of Manhattan, everyone who matters lives within a fairly compact radius of everyone else, and yet the ritual of arriving by carriage, rather than simply walking, is itself part of the performance, a small understood signal that this is a formal occasion, that one does not arrive at a ball on foot regardless of how short the actual distance might be. Through the carriage window she watches the gas lamps, and increasingly in these years, the newer electric streetlights slide past, watches other carriages converging toward the same address from every direction, a slow, glittering procession of the city's wealthiest families all moving toward the same rented or borrowed or purpose-built room for the same few hours of dancing and dining and careful, constant observation. Here is something I want to say honestly, because I think it deserves to be said. For all the strangeness we have covered tonight, the dogs and the monkeys and the horses eating dinner indoors, I do not think most of the women living inside this world experience their own lives as strange. This was simply what an evening was. This was simply what a party looked like, what success looked like, what being taken care of looked like, if you had grown up entirely within these walls and never once needed to imagine an alternative. The extravagance we find so startling now, looking back from the outside, was, from the inside, closer to wallpaper, the ordinary texture of an ordinary Tuesday evening, remarkable only in its smaller details. This particular flower arrangement, this particular soprano hired to perform between courses, rather than in its overall existence. Now, let me tell you about the theatricals, because this is one of my favorite corners of the whole era, and one that gets mentioned far less often than the dinners and the balls. Private theatrical performances, staged entirely within someone's own home, by amateur actors drawn from the family and its social circle, were a genuinely popular form of entertainment throughout this period, and they ranged from modest little productions performed for close friends to enormous, professionally staged spectacles that rivaled anything happening on an actual New York stage that same season. A wealthy family might convert an entire wing of their house, temporarily or, in a few extraordinary cases, permanently, into a working theatre, complete with a raised stage, painted backdrops commissioned from actual scenic artists, and rows of seating for several hundred invited guests. The plays performed were sometimes serious works, scenes from Shakespeare or contemporary drama, and sometimes lighter comic pieces written specifically for the occasion, often with knowing, gently satirical references to the very social circle watching the performance, a joke that only made sense if you had personally attended the same 20 or 30 parties as everyone else in the audience. And then there were the tableaux vivants, which translates roughly as living pictures, and which I think might be the single strangest, most purely aesthetic entertainment of the entire era. A tableau vivant involved a small group of costumed performers, often the young women of the family and their friends, arranging themselves into a completely motionless, silent recreation of a famous painting or a scene from classical mythology or history, held perfectly still for the audience's viewing pleasure, sometimes for several minutes at a stretch, before the curtain closed and reopened on an entirely new frozen scene. There was no dialogue, there was no movement at all, ideally not even a visible breath, though of course everyone breathed, and the challenge, the actual skill being displayed, was in how convincingly a living human body could be made to resemble something entirely still, a painted or sculpted figure brought temporarily and imperfectly into 3 dimensions. Young women competed, in a quiet, unspoken way, over which tableau they were selected to appear in, and over how convincingly they could hold a particular pose, particularly one drawn from a celebrated painting that the assembled guests would recognize immediately and murmur about approvingly. Lighting for these tableaux was arranged with real care, sometimes using colored gas jets or, later, some of the earliest theatrical electric lighting available in private homes, specifically to recreate the exact golden quality of light in whatever painting was being staged. I find something almost tender in this particular entertainment, stranger than the dog dinners, certainly, but somehow less cynical. There is a real, if slightly absurd, kind of devotion in an evening built entirely around the idea that a human body, held perfectly still under careful lighting, could momentarily become a work of art, even if only for the 2 or 3 minutes before the curtain closed again. Of course, not every evening required an entire theatrical production or a table set with live swans. A great deal of Gilded Age entertainment happened at a much smaller scale, around a card table, in a private drawing room, among a handful of friends rather than several hundred formally invited guests. And here, too, the stakes, quite literally, tended to be far higher than most modern readers would assume. Card playing was an enormously popular pastime across this entire society, whist in the earlier decades of the era, giving way gradually to bridge by the 1890s, and baccarat, imported from European gambling houses, favored particularly among a faster, more fashionable set that enjoyed the genuine thrill of real financial risk alongside their evening's entertainment. Private gambling parties, hosted in someone's own drawing room rather than any public gaming hall, allowed wealthy men and women to wager sums that would have been considered scandalous, or in some jurisdictions outright illegal, in a public casino, precisely because a private home offered a kind of social cover that a commercial gambling establishment never could. Some of the wealthiest women in New York developed genuine reputations, whispered about rather than openly discussed, as serious, committed gamblers hosting or attending regular card evenings where sums equivalent to a working family's entire yearly income might change hands over the course of a single night, won or lost on the fall of a card. Treated with the same outward composure a woman of this class was trained to bring to absolutely everything, a bad hand no more permitted to disturb her expression than an unwelcome piece of gossip or an uncomfortable corset. There is something worth noticing in that particular discipline, the sheer practiced steadiness required to lose what amounted to a fortune in an evening without so much as a visible flicker of distress crossing your face, because showing distress would itself have been the greater social failure. Men had their own parallel world of private gambling, often centered around exclusive clubs, wood-paneled rooms with leather chairs where fortunes were occasionally won and lost across a single long night of cards, accompanied by cigars and imported spirits, entirely separate from the world of balls and dinners their wives were managing on the other side of the same city. And I think it is worth pausing here to notice something that runs through nearly every entertainment we have discussed tonight, whether it is dogs in diamond collars, or horses eating dinner indoors, or a fortune changing hands over a card table. In a world where earning more money had, for most of these families, become essentially a non-issue, the money itself had stopped functioning as a practical resource and had started functioning instead as a kind of currency for feeling, for risk, for drama, for the particular electric thrill of watching a very large number simply appear or disappear, because there was, at a certain level of wealth, genuinely nothing else left for the money to accomplish. Out on Long Island, a slightly different flavor of entertainment took root during these same decades, one built less around the glittering interior spectacle of a ballroom and more around horses, hounds, and wide-open country. The American Country Club, as an institution, essentially came into existence during this period, and the earliest examples, clustered across the North Shore of Long Island, were built specifically to import a very particular English fantasy onto American soil, the fantasy of the landed gentleman riding to hounds across rolling countryside he personally owned, or had exclusive access to, an identity that had nothing whatsoever to do with railroads or steel mills or banking, however directly those industries had actually paid for the horse, the hounds, and the countryside itself. Fox hunting became, for a certain set of wealthy New Yorkers, a genuine passion, pursued with real seriousness and real expense. Packs of hounds were imported, bred and trained specifically for the hunt, members maintained entire stables of hunters, horses bred and conditioned specifically for the particular demands of jumping fences and ditches at speed across open country, entirely separate from the carriage horses used for ordinary transportation and the show horses paraded at events back in the city. The formal uniform of the hunt, the distinctive scarlet coat worn by senior members, the specific cut of the breeches and the boots, was governed by its own elaborate, largely unwritten code, every bit as precise and unforgiving as the etiquette governing an evening ball, and a newcomer who wore the wrong color coat or wore the correct coat before he had actually earned the right to it through some unofficial period of apprenticeship within the hunt, could expect to be quietly, permanently marked as someone who did not quite belong. Golf arrived slightly later in the era, imported from Scotland, and quickly became another arena for exactly the same competitive, status-conscious energy that governed everything else in this world. The earliest American country clubs built their golf courses with real care and real expense, importing professional Scottish golf instructors to teach the game properly, and membership in the right club, with access to the right course, became yet another quiet marker of exactly where a family stood in the broader social hierarchy, a marker that, unlike an opera box or a ballroom appearance, could be enjoyed in relative peace, away from the city, surrounded by nothing louder than birdsong and the occasional crack of a well-struck ball. I find something almost restful about this particular corner of the story, if I am honest, a small pocket of this world where the entertainment, however expensive and however exclusive, was at least built around fresh air and physical movement rather than pure spectacle. Even here, though, the underlying logic never really changed. The point was never simply to enjoy an afternoon outdoors. The point was to be seen enjoying it, in the right coat, on the right horse, at the right club, among the right people, all of it quietly, continuously reinforcing the same invisible architecture of status that governed every single other hour of these families' lives. Travel itself, in this world, had become its own form of entertainment, and nowhere is that clearer than in the private railroad car, a genuinely strange invention that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Many of these fortunes had been built, directly or indirectly, on the railroads themselves, and it is perhaps not surprising that the men and women who owned those railroads eventually decided that ordinary passenger travel, even the finest available seating in the finest available train, was simply not good enough for their own personal use. A private railroad car, custom built for a single family, could include a full dining room with a working kitchen and a dedicated chef, a drawing room furnished with the same quality of upholstery and woodwork you would expect in a Fifth Avenue mansion, multiple sleeping compartments, a bathroom with real plumbing, and a small staff of porters and servants whose entire job existed to maintain that single car as it traveled, coupled onto the back of an ordinary passenger train, or occasionally pulled entirely on its own by a chartered locomotive from city to city across the country. Some of the wealthiest families owned several of these cars, positioned strategically at different points around the rail network, so that a family member could arrive at virtually any major city and step immediately into their own familiar, fully staffed accommodations without ever needing to set foot inside a public hotel or a shared rail car at all. The interiors of these private cars were finished with exactly the same obsessive attention to material and craftsmanship as everything else we have discussed tonight. Mahogany paneling, velvet upholstery, fine china, patterned specifically for that car alone, stored in built-in cabinets designed to keep it from rattling as the train moved. Some cars included small libraries, stocked with the owner's personal book collection. Others were fitted with early telephone or telegraph equipment, allowing a traveling businessman to remain in continuous contact with his offices, even while crossing several states. There is something genuinely fascinating in what this reveals about the underlying psychology we have been circling all evening. It was never really about the destination, and honestly, it was not even simply about comfort during the journey. It was about never, under any circumstances, being required to share a physical space with anyone outside your own carefully chosen circle, never needing to sit across from a stranger, never needing to eat a meal prepared by anyone other than your own household staff, never needing to sleep in a bed you had not personally selected the linens for. The private railroad car, in that sense, was simply the mansion on Fifth Avenue and the cottage in Newport extended into motion, a third, mobile version of the same enclosed, self-sufficient world these families had built for themselves, carried at speed across a country most of whose citizens they would never meet, never see, and in the vast majority of cases, never think about at all. Let us talk about jewels properly now, because we have touched on them several times tonight, almost in passing, and they deserve their own careful attention, because jewelry in this world functioned less like personal adornment and more like a second parallel currency, one that moved between families, between generations, and occasionally, quite literally, between continents, carrying meaning far beyond its simple market value. Charles Louis Tiffany had built, by the later decades of the century, the single most important jewelry house in America, and a piece from Tiffany carried a particular cachet, a guarantee not just of quality but of taste that mattered enormously to families still working to establish their own social legitimacy. Tiffany supplied the diamonds, the pearls, the elaborate tiaras that appeared evening after evening in that glittering diamond horseshoe we visited earlier at the opera, and increasingly, as the century turned, a French competitor began making serious inroads into the same American market, a house called Cartier, whose designers brought a different aesthetic sensibility, more delicate, more architectural, drawing on garland-style motifs borrowed from 18th century French decorative art, and American heiresses marrying into European titles. Women very much like Consuelo Vanderbilt became some of Cartier's most important early clients, commissioning pieces that blended American money with genuinely aristocratic European design. We mentioned earlier that Caroline Astor appeared at one particularly memorable gathering covered, quite literally from head to toe, in diamonds, even her shoes reportedly studded with stones, an outfit that functioned less as fashion and more as a kind of walking announcement of exactly how much wealth this one woman controlled. Other women in this circle changed their jewels multiple times within a single day, morning pieces different from afternoon pieces, different again from whatever was selected for the evening's main event. An entire private collection, large enough that one particularly devoted collector maintained her own dedicated storage vault directly at Tiffany's premises, rather than attempting to keep such value inside her own home. And here I want to return one final time to Mamie Fish's famous dog collar, because I think it deserves to be understood properly within this larger context, rather than simply as an isolated comic anecdote. $15,000 spent on a diamond collar for an actual dog sounds, on its own, like pure absurdist comedy, and it is. But it also sits perfectly within the internal logic of a world where jewelry itself had become detached from any ordinary sense of proportion or utility, where a woman might spend that same sum, or considerably more, on a single evening's worth of jewels worn for a few hours at the opera, and where the difference between decorating a person and decorating an animal had in a very real sense stopped mattering, because the actual point, in either case, was never really about the wearer at all. It was about demonstrating, through sheer accumulated value, glittering under gaslight or the still newer electric light, exactly how much this family had, and exactly how little that much money had left to actually purchase, once every practical need had been satisfied many times over. There is another side to this same impulse worth mentioning, one that ran quieter than the balls and the dinners, but touched an even larger sum of money over the course of the era, and that is the collecting of art and European antiquities. Many of these families, having built fortunes in industries their own society still, quietly, considered a little vulgar, railroads and steel and meatpacking and oil, discovered that acquiring genuine old-world culture, entire rooms of European paneling shipped across the Atlantic and reassembled inside a Fifth Avenue mansion, actual paintings by recognized old masters hung in a private drawing room, offered a particular kind of legitimacy that no amount of new money could otherwise purchase quite so directly. Agents were dispatched to Europe, sometimes for months at a stretch, tasked with locating and purchasing entire collections, sometimes buying up the contents of a cash-strapped European noble family's estate in a single transaction, tapestries and furniture and statuary and portraiture, crated and shipped across the ocean to be reassembled inside a house that had, in some cases, been standing for less than a decade. One wealthy collector might fill an entire gallery within his own home with Renaissance paintings, viewable, on invitation only, by other members of his social circle, a private museum that existed to be admired rather than genuinely, quietly enjoyed, though of course some collectors, to be fair, developed real lasting expertise and real personal passion for the objects they acquired. I find something worth noticing in how directly this connects to everything else we have discussed tonight. The impulse behind commissioning a Worth gown, worn once and then retired to a dedicated storage room, and the impulse behind purchasing an entire wing of European antiquity to be installed inside a New York mansion are, at bottom, the same impulse, wearing two very different costumes. Both are attempts to purchase something that money alone cannot directly manufacture, whether that something is taste, or history, or legitimacy, or simply the settled, permanent feeling of having always belonged exactly where you currently stand. New money, however vast, could buy nearly everything in this world except time itself, except the simple fact of having been established for 3 or 4 or 5 generations rather than one. And so it spent itself, endlessly, cleverly, sometimes almost desperately, trying to purchase a convincing substitute. I promised you honesty earlier tonight, and I want to make good on that promise now, because it would be a disservice to spend this entire evening laughing at diamond dog collars and horseback dinners, without also sitting, for a few minutes, with what all of this actually cost, and who actually paid for it, because the people paying were almost never the people at the table. In 1899, an economist named Thorstein Veblen published a book that gave this entire phenomenon a name that has outlasted almost everything else from the era, a phrase that has become so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary English that most people using it today have no idea it originated as a direct, pointed critique of exactly the world we have spent this evening exploring. He called it conspicuous consumption, the deliberate public spending of money not to satisfy any genuine need, but specifically to display to anyone watching that you possessed far more money than any genuine need could ever require. Veblen understood something that I think this entire evening's worth of stories has been quietly circling around from the very beginning. The dog dinners, the horseback banquet, the gowns worn once and then permanently retired, none of it was really wasteful in the sense that word usually implies. It was working exactly as intended. Waste, in this particular economic logic, was the entire point. The visible destruction of resources that could otherwise have been put to practical use was, itself, the message being sent, a message that only someone with genuinely limitless resources could afford to send, and afford to keep sending, evening after evening, for decades. And while all of this was happening, in the same city, often within a short carriage ride of the same Fifth Avenue mansions, a very different New York was living an entirely different reality. A photographer and journalist named Jacob Riis had, just a few years before the Bradley Martin Ball, published a book documenting conditions in the tenement neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, families of 6 or 8 or 10 people crowded into a single small room, often without adequate light or ventilation, working children, disease spreading rapidly through buildings that had never been designed with anything resembling basic sanitation in mind. Riis's photographs, taken with the newly available technology of flash photography, showed rooms so dark and so cramped that many of his more comfortable readers, people not entirely unlike the guests we have been discussing all evening, reportedly found them genuinely difficult to believe, difficult to accept as belonging to the same city they themselves inhabited. The economic depression that had settled over the country by the early 1890s, the same depression that made the Bradley Martin Ball so catastrophically ill-timed, meant that unemployment in many American cities climbed well above 20% for a period of years, families losing homes, children going without adequate food, a scale of genuine widespread suffering that existed in almost complete deliberate isolation from the world of calling cards and cotillion favors we have spent tonight exploring. It is not that the wealthy families of this era were unaware such poverty existed. Some of them, to their credit, genuinely engaged in charitable work, organizing relief efforts, funding hospitals and settlement houses, and we should be fair enough to acknowledge that. But the fundamental architecture of this world, the enormous, unbridgeable gap between a $50,000 dinner for a dog and a family surviving on a few dollars a week in a windowless tenement room, was never treated, by most of the people benefiting from it, as a problem requiring any structural solution. It was simply the given shape of the world, the way weather is a given shape of the world, something to be occasionally alleviated at the margins through charity, but never fundamentally questioned. I want to tell you a story now about a feud, because I think it explains the psychology of this entire world more efficiently than almost anything else we could discuss tonight, and because it produced, almost by accident, one of the most famous hallways in American history. In 1893, a wealthy man named William Waldorf Astor made a decision that had nothing to do with hotel management and everything to do with spite. He had grown tired, genuinely tired, of living in the social shadow of his own aunt, the same Caroline Astor who has been our recurring monarch all evening long, the woman whose ballroom capacity supposedly defined the entire concept of the 400. So William did something almost operatic in its pettiness. He tore down his own family mansion on Fifth Avenue, a house standing directly next door to his aunt's, and built in its place a 13-story hotel, positioned in such a way that it deliberately blocked light and air from his aunt's own house next door. Caroline Astor's response was not to move, and not to complain, at least not publicly. Her own son, a few years later, responded by constructing an even larger, even more lavish hotel immediately adjacent to his cousin's, on the site of Caroline's own house, which she had by then relocated further uptown. Two feuding branches of the same family, each building an enormous luxury hotel specifically to outdo the other, standing shoulder to shoulder on the same city block. Eventually, practicality won out over pride, and the two hotels were formally joined together into a single operation, the Waldorf Astoria, connected by a long marble-lined corridor between the two buildings. That corridor became, almost immediately, one of the single most important social stages in all of New York, a role nobody had originally designed it to play. Society writers began referring to it as Peacock Alley, because it so quickly became the place where the fashionable set walked, slowly, deliberately, dressed in their absolute finest, specifically to be seen walking. A runway roughly 300 feet long, where an entrance could, quite literally, secure or destroy an entire season's worth of social standing, depending on how it was received by everyone else strolling that same stretch of marble that same afternoon. People coined an entirely new verb from the scene, to peacock, to walk in a way calculated purely for display, and the word has outlived nearly everyone who ever actually walked that hallway. I find something almost perfect about this story, because it distills, into one single architectural anecdote, nearly everything we have discussed tonight, a family feud resolved not through conversation, but through competitive construction, an enormous, genuinely staggering expenditure, born from personal spite rather than practical need, and the accidental creation, out of all that spite and expense, of a purely theatrical space, a hallway whose entire function became the simple, continuous performance of being watched by people who had, by that point in the era, very little left to do with their lives except be watched. Well, and often. Let us slow down and talk properly about the food itself, because I have mentioned course count several times tonight without really describing what those courses actually contained, and the specific dishes fashionable in this era tell their own quiet story about excess and status. A type of small freshwater turtle was considered one of the great delicacies of the American table in this period, prepared in a rich, slow-simmered stew built around butter and sherry, a dish so labor-intensive and so dependent on a genuinely limited natural supply that serving it at your table announced, without a single word being spoken, that your household could obtain what most households simply could not. Canvasback duck occupied a similar position, a particular species prized specifically for the taste its flesh developed from feeding on a certain wild plant found in the waters around the Chesapeake Bay, considered so superior to ordinary duck that a fashionable menu would specify the exact provenance of the bird being served, as though naming a vintage of wine. Terrapin and canvasback, served together, became something close to a signature combination at the most important dinners of the era, a pairing so closely associated with wealth and status that simply naming the two dishes together in a newspaper account of some society dinner communicated everything a reader needed to know about the evening's ambitions. French cuisine dominated the actual cooking, and the most prestigious households competed genuinely fiercely to secure the services of a proper French-trained chef, sometimes recruiting directly from the kitchens of European royalty or from the finest Parisian restaurants, paying salaries that rivaled what a mid-level executive might earn, purely to ensure that every sauce and every reduction met a standard that French culinary training alone, in the understanding of the period, could reliably guarantee. Menus at the most formal dinners were, by convention, printed entirely in French, regardless of how few of the assembled American guests could actually read the language with any real fluency, because the French language itself functioned as another small marker of sophistication, another quiet signal that this household understood exactly how things were properly done. And then there was the ice, sculpted, at the largest and most theatrical dinners, into elaborate centerpieces, swans and classical figures, and sometimes entire miniature architectural scenes, carved by specialists whose entire profession existed to produce objects of tremendous, deliberate impermanence. A sculpture built purely to slowly, visibly melt over the course of a single evening's dinner, its inevitable disappearance somehow part of the intended effect rather than a flaw in it. I think there is something worth noticing in that particular choice, an entire skilled craft dedicated to producing beauty, specifically designed not to last, poured labor and cost into an object that both the sculptor and the guests understood, from the very first moment it appeared on the table, would be nothing but a puddle by the time coffee was served. It might be the single most honest metaphor for the whole era that we have encountered tonight, more honest in its way than the diamonds or the gowns, because at least the ice never pretended to be anything other than exactly what it was, gorgeous, briefly, and then gone. Let us step back into the ballroom now, because I think it is time to simply stay there for a while, rather than continuing to move quickly from anecdote to anecdote. Picture the room itself first. Ceilings rising perhaps 25 or 30 feet overhead, painted with elaborate murals in the French style, cherubs and clouds and classical figures drifting across a painted sky that never changes regardless of the actual weather outside. Along the walls, mirrors in gilded frames, positioned deliberately to multiply the light of the chandeliers and multiply too the sense of space, so that a large room feels somehow even larger, the crowd within it reflected back on itself from a dozen different angles at once. The flowers arrive fresh that same afternoon, thousands of them, hothouse roses and orchids and lilies grown specifically out of season in heated greenhouses maintained purely for this kind of occasion, because a ballroom decorated with flowers that could only be found blooming naturally in December carried its own quiet message about resources and control over nature itself. The scent of all that concentrated floral perfume, mixed with candle wax and the specific mineral smell of hot gas lamps, and, in the later years of the era, the faint, clean, slightly electric smell of the newest lighting technology, all of it blending together into an atmosphere that guests of this era would have recognized immediately, walking through any grand New York doorway, as the unmistakable smell of money being spent. The orchestra, positioned on a raised platform at one end of the room, plays continuously for hours, waltzes mostly, the specific 3-beat rhythm that had, by this point in the century, become the standard heartbeat of formal dancing, though a well-planned evening would also include the more elaborate, rehearsed quadrilles we discussed earlier, and eventually, as the evening wound toward its later hours, the extended, favor-filled ritual of the German. Listen for a moment to the sound underneath the music itself, the particular rustle of silk against silk as dozens of women move through the same room at once, the soft, steady click of heeled shoes against a polished floor, low conversation layered over the music, never quite loud enough to be heard clearly from more than a few feet away, so that every conversation in the room exists in its own small, private bubble of sound, even while surrounded by several hundred other people doing exactly the same thing. Maybe our young woman from earlier tonight is dancing right now, moving through a waltz with practiced, unhurried grace, her feet finding the rhythm automatically after years of exactly this kind of evening. Maybe for just these few minutes, turning slowly under all that gilded light, she is not thinking about calling cards or invitation lists or which family might be watching which conversation. Maybe for just these few minutes it is simply beautiful, and she simply lets it be beautiful, without needing to calculate anything at all. I think that possibility deserves to exist in this story too, alongside everything else we have discussed tonight. Not every moment inside this glittering, strange, unequal world was calculation. Some of it, at least sometimes, for at least some of the people living inside it, was simply, genuinely joy. Around midnight, the dancing pauses, and the guests move through into the supper room, which has, over the course of the evening, been transformed by an entirely separate small army of staff into its own complete spectacle. A table or series of tables stretching the full length of the room, laid with the household's finest china and crystal and silver, much of it brought out specifically for occasions of exactly this scale and otherwise kept locked away in specially built cabinets for the rest of the year. Candlelight here is deliberately softer than in the ballroom, arranged to flatter rather than illuminate, and the flowers on this table are usually smaller, more intimate, chosen to complement rather than compete with the food itself. Course after course arrives in careful sequence, carried by uniformed footmen, moving with the practiced silent choreography of people who have rehearsed this exact service many times before, timing each dish so that no guest waits uncomfortably long between courses, and no course arrives before the previous one has been properly cleared. A clear soup, delicate and lightly seasoned, meant to open the palate rather than fill the stomach. Then perhaps a fish course, poached or delicately sauced. Then the terrapin we discussed a moment ago, or the canvasback duck, arriving with real ceremony, sometimes presented briefly to the table whole before being carved and served, so that the guests could appreciate the dish's full visual presentation before it was broken down into individual portions. Wine flows continuously throughout, a different vintage selected specifically to complement each course, poured by staff trained to know exactly how much to offer, exactly when to refill a glass without being asked, exactly when to discreetly leave a glass alone. Champagne always for the toasts, and often continuing well beyond any formal toast, simply as the evening's default beverage of celebration. By the time dessert arrives, some elaborate construction of spun sugar or molded ice cream or delicate pastry, most guests are, by any reasonable measure, thoroughly, comfortably full, and yet the meal continues regardless, through fruit and nuts and finally coffee, because a proper Gilded Age supper was never really designed around anyone's actual appetite. It was designed around demonstrating exactly how much abundance a household could produce and serve, gracefully, without a single visible strain, in a single continuous evening. I want you to notice something in this description, something easy to miss underneath all the abundance. Every single element of this meal required advanced planning stretching back weeks, sometimes months. The terrapin had to be sourced and kept properly. The hothouse flowers had to be forced into bloom on a precise schedule. The wines had to be selected and in some cases imported specifically for this one evening. An enormous, largely invisible logistical operation run by household staff whose names we will likely never know, made possible every single minute of this glittering, effortless-seeming evening, and by the time the last of the guests finally departed, sometime near dawn, that same staff would already be beginning the long, quiet work of cleaning, restoring, and putting everything away so that the house could stand ready, once again, for whatever came next. Let me tell you about one more animal-related party before we move on, because it connects back to Mamie Fisher's elephant, and because private menageries turn out to have been a genuinely recurring feature of the wildest end of Gilded Age entertaining, stranger, in some ways, than anything we have covered so far. Wealthy hosts occasionally arranged for exotic animals, borrowed or rented from traveling circuses and private collectors, to appear at parties purely as living novelty, guests arriving for what they believed would be an ordinary evening, only to find a camel standing in the front hall, or a small trained bear performing tricks in the middle of a drawing room, or, as we already discussed, an actual elephant being fed peanuts by hired dancers, while several hundred guests in full evening dress looked on with a mixture of delight and mild alarm. There is something worth pausing on here, because I think it reveals a specific kind of restlessness underneath all this wealth, a genuine, almost desperate hunger for novelty that ordinary luxury could no longer satisfy. By a certain point in this competitive cycle, an excellent dinner was simply expected, a beautiful ballroom was simply expected, a famous orchestra, fine champagne, elaborate flowers, all of it had become in effect the baseline, the bare minimum required to even be taken seriously as a hostess in this world. And once the baseline itself had become this extraordinary, the only way to actually surprise anyone, the only way to produce that genuine gasp of astonishment a hostess like Mamie Fish clearly lived for, was to reach for something categorically strange, something nobody had thought to attempt before: a live elephant in a drawing room, a monkey seated as a guest of honor, horses climbing 4 floors in a freight elevator to eat dinner indoors. It strikes me, thinking about it now, that this pattern is almost universal. Wherever you find enough concentrated wealth chasing enough concentrated boredom across a long enough stretch of time, ordinary pleasures lose their charge quickly when they are available every single day without limit. And so the search for novelty accelerates, each new party needing to outdo the last, each hostess needing her particular evening to be the one people were still discussing weeks later, until eventually, almost inevitably, that search arrives somewhere genuinely absurd: an elephant in a Manhattan drawing room, a monkey dressed for dinner, because absurdity, it turns out, is one of the very few things that money, applied with sufficient confidence, can always still reliably purchase. Let us talk about New Year's Day for a moment, because it operated under its own peculiar set of rules, distinct from the rest of the social calendar, and because the ritual itself, once genuinely charming in its earlier, more modest form, eventually grew into another arena for exactly the same competitive display we have traced all evening. For much of the 19th century, New York observed a tradition, inherited originally from Dutch colonial custom, in which women remained at home on New Year's Day, receiving callers, while men traveled from house to house across the city, paying brief, formal visits to as many acquaintances as they could reasonably manage in a single day. A genuinely democratic little custom in its earliest form, meant to renew social bonds across an entire community at the start of a fresh year. By the height of the Gilded Age, this modest tradition had transformed into something considerably grander and considerably more calculated. A fashionable household preparing to receive New Year's callers might spend weeks in advance planning the refreshments, the flowers, the exact composition of a receiving line, because the number and prominence of callers who appeared at your door that day functioned as a fairly precise, publicly visible measurement of exactly where your family currently stood in the social order. A house that received a genuine flood of important callers throughout the day had in effect been publicly reconfirmed as socially significant. A house that received comparatively few callers, or callers of comparatively modest standing, absorbed that message too, quietly, privately, without anyone needing to say a single unkind word out loud. Some of the wealthiest hostesses turned the day into an event nearly as elaborate as any formal ball, laying out entire buffets of oysters and cold meats and champagne punch, hiring musicians to provide background entertainment for a day that might see hundreds of individual callers passing through over the course of a single afternoon and evening, each one greeted personally, each one remembered, each one mentally filed away as evidence of exactly how far this particular household's social reach genuinely extended. Eventually, as the tradition grew more and more burdensome, more and more expensive, and increasingly abused by men who used the day as an excuse for genuinely excessive drinking, as they moved from house to house, the custom itself began to fall out of fashion, quietly abandoned by many of the very families who had once helped make it so extravagant. One more small ritual, born from genuine community feeling, eventually consumed and hollowed out by the same relentless logic of display that governed almost everything else in this particular corner of American history. Let me tell you about one final ball before we move toward the later chapters of this story, because it offers a genuinely satisfying, almost novelistic conclusion to the pattern we have been tracing all evening. In January of 1905, a young bachelor named James Hazen Hyde, not yet 30 years old, heir to a controlling stake in one of the largest life insurance companies in the entire world, decided to host a costume ball at Sherry's, the same fashionable restaurant where the horses had climbed the freight elevator 2 years earlier. Hyde was a genuine Francophile, fluent in the language, deeply devoted to 18th century French culture, and he threw himself into planning an evening built entirely around recreating the court of Louis XV at Versailles. He hired the celebrated architect Stanford White to transform 2 entire floors of Sherry's into a convincing recreation of the Versailles Gardens. Real grass laid down across the restaurant floor, elaborate floral installations recreating formal French garden design, a scale of theatrical transformation that by this point in our story should sound almost familiar to you. Roughly 600 guests arrived that January evening in elaborate period costume, many of them wearing genuine historical jewels, pieces that had, according to some accounts, once belonged to actual European empresses. Women dressed as court ladies of Versailles, wearing costumes embroidered directly with emeralds and pearls. A midnight performance of a short French theatrical piece entertained the guests before dinner was finally served in a room dressed to resemble a Versailles garden so completely that one contemporary account noted the illusion would have been nearly perfect, if not for a single guest loudly, insistently demanding hard-boiled eggs and a glass of milk. A small, very human interruption in the middle of so much orchestrated grandeur. The total cost of the evening ran to roughly $200,000. The party itself, by every account, was a triumph. And then, within weeks, it became the instrument of Hyde's complete professional destruction. Rival executives at his own insurance company, men who had long resented his position and his youth, and his inherited control over such an enormous business, seized on the ball as ammunition, spreading the accusation, ultimately proven false, that Hyde had paid for his lavish Versailles evening using company funds rather than his own personal fortune. The resulting scandal spiraled quickly into a genuine crisis, drawing regulatory investigation into the entire insurance industry, and by the following year, Hyde had been forced to resign every position he held, ultimately relocating permanently to France, where he lived out most of the remainder of his life. A single evening's entertainment, dazzling and celebrated in every newspaper the very next morning, had, within a matter of months, ended a young man's entire American career. I find something almost fitting in this story as a marker of where the era was headed. By 1905, the same kind of unrestrained extravagance that had once simply generated admiring newspaper coverage, the same recreation of Versailles that Cornelia Bradley Martin had staged 8 years earlier at considerably greater cost, had become genuinely dangerous, capable of ending careers, inviting real regulatory scrutiny, providing exactly the kind of ammunition that rivals and reformers alike were increasingly eager to use. The mood of the country, and even of the wealthy themselves, toward each other had begun, slowly but unmistakably, to shift. Let us talk, gently, about how all of this eventually came to an end, because nothing in history simply continues forever unchanged, and this particular golden, glittering world was no exception. Several forces, arriving roughly together over the span of about a decade, worked to close the specific chapter we have spent this whole evening exploring. Caroline Astor, our recurring monarch, the woman whose ballroom capacity gave rise to the entire idea of the 400, died in 1908, and her death removed the single most important gatekeeper this world had ever known, the one figure whose personal approval had for decades determined who genuinely counted in New York society and who did not. Without her at the center, holding the whole intricate structure together through sheer force of personal authority, the rules that had governed this world for a generation began, slowly, to loosen. The federal government introduced a permanent income tax in 1913, following a constitutional amendment specifically enabling it, and while the initial rates were modest by later standards, the principle itself represented something genuinely new, a formal, institutional acknowledgement that enormous private fortunes were not simply private matters, that the nation had a legitimate claim on a portion of wealth that had for the previous several decades existed almost entirely outside any such obligation. It was the first small crack in an entire system that had allowed fortunes like the Vanderbilts and the Astors to accumulate with essentially no structural check on their scale. And then in 1914, war arrived in Europe, and by 1917, the United States had entered it directly, and the entire psychological climate of the country shifted in ways that made the specific, unapologetic extravagance we have spent tonight discussing feel, almost overnight, deeply, uncomfortably out of step with the national mood. Young men from these same wealthy families were, in many cases, genuinely serving overseas. Rationing and patriotic austerity became fashionable in their own right, in a way that made a $50,000 dog birthday party feel, quite suddenly, like something from an entirely different, faintly embarrassing era rather than simply last season's news. By the time the war ended, the world that had produced the Bradley Martin ball and the horseback dinner and Mamie Fish's monkey dressed for dinner had not vanished entirely. Wealth of this scale certainly persisted, and would persist in various forms for the rest of American history. But that particular flavor of it, the specific, unguarded, theatrical confidence that allowed a hostess to seat 100 dogs at their own dinner table without a flicker of self-consciousness, belonged, by the 1920s, unmistakably to the past. The parties of the next decade would look different, would sound different, would carry a different kind of nervous energy entirely, the frantic, slightly anxious brightness of the Jazz Age, rather than the settled, almost sleepy confidence of the true Gilded Age at its height. Something had genuinely ended, something had genuinely, if quietly, been lost, and something else, for better and for worse, had begun to take its place. Let me tell you about Fifth Avenue itself for a moment, because the street underwent its own remarkable transformation across these same decades, becoming in effect a physical monument to everything we have discussed tonight. In the middle of the century, the stretch of Fifth Avenue running through the 40s and 50s had been a relatively modest, respectable residential district, brownstone row houses standing in dignified, understated rows. By the 1890s, that same stretch of street had become something else entirely, an unbroken procession of enormous private palaces, each one competing openly with its neighbors, French chateau facades, standing beside Italian Renaissance palazzos, standing beside English manor houses, an entire imported European architectural vocabulary compressed into a few dense city blocks, each family's chosen style announcing something specific about the particular flavor of legitimacy they were hoping to claim. Richard Morris Hunt, the same architect responsible for several of the great Newport cottages, designed a number of these Fifth Avenue mansions as well, along with his professional rivals and collaborators, and the competition between families over whose house would be grander, whose facade more imposing, whose interior more lavishly appointed, ran with exactly the same intensity as the competition over dinners and balls we have spent all evening exploring. A newly wealthy family arriving in New York with a fortune made in the last decade might commission a house explicitly designed to overshadow an older, more established family's residence, standing just a few doors down, a form of architectural one-upmanship playing out in stone and marble along a single famous street, visible to absolutely everyone who walked or rode past. The interiors of these houses pursued the same competitive logic inward. Entire rooms were sometimes purchased whole from actual European buildings, dismantled piece by piece overseas, shipped across the Atlantic, and reassembled, paneling and ceiling and all, inside a New York mansion barely a decade old, so that a guest walking from one room to the next might pass from a genuine 17th century French salon into a genuine Renaissance Italian dining hall, into a room decorated in a style borrowed from ancient Pompeii, each space its own small imported world, stitched together under a single roof, built specifically to house this particular family's specific, curated version of European history. I find something worth noticing in just how literally this all functioned as costume. In the end, the same impulse driving the single evening gowns and the single evening jewels applied now to an entire house, an entire street. These families were not simply building homes to live in, they were building elaborate permanent stage sets, backdrops sufficiently grand and sufficiently convincing that the family itself, moving through those rooms each day, might begin to believe a little more each year in the legitimacy the architecture was so carefully designed to suggest. None of what we have discussed tonight would have mattered nearly as much, socially, without the newspapers, and I want to spend a few minutes on the society column itself, because it functioned as a genuinely essential piece of machinery in this entire world, the mechanism that converted a single evening's private spectacle into something the whole city, and often the whole country, could witness second-hand. Every major New York newspaper maintained dedicated society reporters by this period, writers whose entire professional purpose was to attend or gain detailed second-hand accounts of the important balls and dinners of the season, and to report back, in exhaustive, loving detail, exactly who had attended, exactly what they had worn, exactly what had been served, and exactly how the whole affair compared to whatever the rival hostess had produced the week before. These accounts were read voraciously, not only by the small circle of people who might actually have been present, but by an enormous audience of ordinary readers across the entire country, people who would never come remotely close to attending an event like this, reading detailed descriptions of dresses that cost more than they would earn in years, purely for the pleasure, or perhaps the useful outrage, of glimpsing a world so completely removed from their own daily reality. In that sense, the society column of this era functioned as something close to an early ancestor of modern celebrity coverage, an entire genre of journalism built around the simple, durable human appetite for watching how the very fortunate actually live. And the families themselves understood this dynamic perfectly well, and used it deliberately. A hostess planning an elaborate ball was not merely planning an evening for the several hundred guests who would physically attend. She was planning, simultaneously, for the tens of thousands of readers who would encounter a detailed account of that same evening, the following morning, over their own considerably more modest breakfast table. Some hostesses cultivated genuinely close relationships with particular society reporters, ensuring favorable, detailed coverage of their own events, while working, sometimes not entirely subtly, to ensure a rival's evening received comparatively thin or unflattering treatment in the same publication. The competition for social prestige, in other words, was never confined purely to the room where a given party actually took place. It extended directly into the newsroom, into which specific details a reporter chose to include or omit, into the careful cultivation of a public reputation that mattered every bit as much as whatever had actually happened behind a given family's closed front door. I want to spend a few minutes now on the rivalries themselves, because underneath all the individual parties we have discussed tonight sat a set of ongoing, deeply personal competitions between specific women, each one determined to be recognized as the most inventive, the most powerful, the most talked about hostess of her particular moment. Alva Vanderbilt and Mamie Fish, two women we have returned to again and again this evening, moved in overlapping circles for years, and their relationship, by most surviving accounts, ran hot and cold, depending on the season, alliance one year, open needling the next. Mamie Fish had a genuine talent for the pointed remark, delivered in that famously loud, unmistakable voice of hers, and Alva Vanderbilt, whatever else one might say about her, was not a woman inclined to simply absorb an insult without eventually finding her own way to respond. Accounts from the period describe the two women clashing directly on at least one occasion, after word reached Alva that Mamie had made an unflattering comparison involving her appearance, and the confrontation that followed became, itself, another small piece of social theatre, discussed and embellished in drawing rooms across the city for weeks afterward, in exactly the same way a particularly extravagant dinner might be discussed and embellished. This is worth understanding as its own genuine form of entertainment within the era, separate from the formal balls and dinners we have spent most of tonight exploring. Society itself, the ongoing, semi-public drama of who was feuding with whom, who had been slighted, whose daughter had been overlooked for whose invitation, functioned as a kind of continuous, real-time serial narrative that this entire small world followed with the same close attention a modern audience might bring to a favorite show. Gossip was not incidental to this society. It was in many ways one of its primary products, endlessly generated, endlessly consumed, endlessly reported second-hand at the very same dinner tables and card parties where the next chapter of the story would inevitably unfold. And I think this detail humanizes the whole strange glittering machine a little, if I am honest. Behind the diamonds and the dogs and the horses, these were, after all, just people, competitive and insecure and occasionally genuinely funny, using whatever tools they had available, jewelry, insults, elaborate parties, to establish exactly where they stood relative to everyone else in a world that offered remarkably few other ways of measuring a life. Weddings themselves deserve a few minutes of our time tonight, because they represented, in this particular world, perhaps the single largest and most concentrated burst of display any family would ever undertake, larger even than the grandest ball, precisely because a wedding combined every single element we have discussed this evening into one enormous, unrepeatable occasion. The gown, commissioned from Worth or a house of similar standing months in advance, constructed from the finest silk available, trimmed with lace that might genuinely be generations old, passed down specifically for this purpose. The floral displays, requiring entire greenhouses worth of out-of-season blooms. The ceremony itself, held at whichever church carried sufficient social prestige to be considered appropriate, followed by a reception that might easily rival the Bradley Martin Ball in sheer scale and expense. And then there were the gifts, displayed by firm and unbending convention in a dedicated room set aside specifically for that purpose, arranged on long tables with small printed cards identifying exactly who had sent each item, so that arriving guests could walk slowly through the display, admiring not only the bride's good fortune but also, quite precisely, which of her family's friends and relations had spent how much and on what, a silent, carefully documented ledger of social obligation rendered entirely in silver and porcelain and jewels. A well-connected bride might receive dozens of complete silver services, ornate tea sets, and elaborate candelabra and place settings for 40, many of them duplicates, many of them destined to sit largely unused in storage for the rest of the marriage, valuable purely as evidence of how thoroughly this particular wedding had been noticed by the people who mattered. Consuelo Vanderbilt's own wedding, which we discussed earlier tonight, included jewelry gifts from her mother alone that were valued, by some contemporary accounts, in the hundreds of thousands of dollars, pieces specifically commissioned to mark the occasion of a marriage that, as we know, brought the bride herself very little genuine happiness at all. There is something worth sitting with in that particular detail, the sheer scale of material celebration surrounding a union that both parties involved had entered largely out of calculation rather than affection, an entire industry of gift-giving and gown-making and flower arranging, mobilized in full, glittering force around a bride who arrived at her own church with visibly reddened eyes. The wedding, in other words, performed joy with tremendous, expensive precision, whether or not joy happened to be genuinely present underneath all that silk and silver. Christmas, too, carried its own particular weight in this world, arriving each year in the middle of the winter social season, and wealthy families approached the holiday with exactly the same competitive theatrical energy they brought to everything else we have discussed tonight. A well-appointed household might install a Christmas tree reaching all the way to a ballroom's soaring ceiling, decorated not with the simple ornaments a middle-class family might use, but with genuine candles in specially designed holders, real silver and gold trim, and, in the households wealthy and forward-thinking enough to have already installed electricity, some of the very earliest strings of electric Christmas lights in the entire country, a novelty so new and so impressive that guests would sometimes be invited specifically to view the illuminated tree as its own small evening's entertainment, gathering to watch the newest technology transform an old winter tradition into something that must have felt, to eyes accustomed only to candlelight and gas, almost supernatural. Gift-giving within these families operated on its own inflated scale. Children of the wealthiest households might wake to find entire rooms rearranged around their presents, not simply a few wrapped boxes under a tree, but elaborate, staged displays, miniature carriages, and full sets of jeweled toys, and, as we discussed earlier, entire commissioned dollhouses, sometimes unveiled specifically on Christmas morning as the culmination of months of secret craftsmanship. Adults exchanged gifts of a similarly inflated scale, jewelry and furs, and occasionally genuinely startling extravagances. One piece of family lore from this general period, describing a husband who presented his wife with a small yacht as a Christmas gift, wrapped, as the story goes, in a ribbon large enough to be visible from the dock. Charitable giving also intensified during this season, and it is worth acknowledging fairly that many of these same families did direct real substantial resources toward genuine relief efforts during the winter months, funding soup kitchens and toy drives and hospital wards, motivated by some combination of genuine Christian charity, social obligation, and the same impulse toward visible display that governed everything else in their lives. A family's name attached prominently to a well-publicized charitable donation carried real social value in its own right, meaning that even generosity, in this particular world, rarely existed entirely separate from the larger, continuous performance of status that ran underneath every single one of these families' public actions, whether that action was hosting a dinner for 100 dogs, or funding a ward at a children's hospital, I want to touch briefly on the sheer logistics of simply moving a household through this yearly calendar, because it is easy, listening to individual party after individual party, to lose sight of just how much continuous, coordinated effort sat underneath the entire structure of this world. A family of this standing did not simply live in one house. They maintained typically a townhouse in New York for the winter season, a cottage in Newport for the summer weeks, and quite often a third property somewhere else entirely, the Adirondacks, or a southern retreat for early spring, and increasingly for the wealthiest families, an extended stay in Europe, sometimes stretching across several months, timed to coincide with the London season, or a fashionable stretch of the French coast. Moving between these households required transporting not just the family itself, but a substantial portion of their belongings and staff. Trunks of clothing packed and shipped ahead by rail, favorite pieces of furniture sometimes relocated seasonally between properties, and key household staff traveling alongside the family to maintain the same standard of service in each new location. A lady's maid, who had spent months perfecting exactly how her mistress preferred her hair arranged, did not simply hand that responsibility to an unfamiliar Newport servant for the summer. She traveled too, along with a cook familiar with the family's preferred dishes, and often a small core of the most trusted household staff, while additional local servants were hired seasonally at each property to fill out the full complement required to run a house of this scale. This meant that a family's actual domestic staff, considered across all their properties and across the full calendar year, could run to genuinely enormous numbers, sometimes several dozen people employed across a single family's various households, an entire small workforce whose year revolved entirely around following this one family from address to address, season to season, maintaining, wherever the family happened to be standing at any given moment, the exact same seamless, effortless seeming comfort that made all of this look, from the family's own perspective, entirely natural and entirely unremarkable. We are not spending tonight's story on the lives of that staff, but I think it is worth pausing, just for a moment, to notice how much continuous human labor made possible the illusion, so carefully maintained at every single party we have discussed tonight, that abundance of this kind simply arrived on its own, effortlessly, the moment a family required it. Toward the very end of the era we have been exploring tonight, a new machine arrived that briefly became the single most important status symbol available, more immediately impressive for a few short years than any gown or any jewel. The automobile reached wealthy New York households in the final years of the 1890s and the first years of the 1900s, and the very earliest owners of these strange, loud, unreliable machines treated them with exactly the same theatrical enthusiasm we have watched applied to everything else tonight. Early automobiles were extraordinarily expensive, genuinely unreliable, and required a dedicated, specially trained employee, the chauffeur, whose job combined driving with a fairly serious amount of ongoing mechanical maintenance, since these early vehicles broke down with real regularity and required someone on hand who actually understood their still quite primitive engineering. Owning one of these machines meant something specific in this world, an unmistakable signal that a family was current, modern, forward-looking, willing to spend an enormous sum on a form of transportation that remained, for most of the country, a source of genuine bewilderment or outright fear, since horses on city streets sometimes bolted in panic at the sound and smell of these new contraptions passing by. Wealthy families staged automobile parades along fashionable stretches of road specifically to display their newest acquisitions to each other, competing over which family owned the fastest or most elegant model, exactly the same impulse that drove the competition over yachts and horses, simply transferred onto an entirely new kind of machine. Newport, predictably, became an early center for this particular enthusiasm too. Automobile races held along its coastal roads, drawing the same crowd that gathered for the yacht races and the tennis tournaments. One more arena in which this world's endless appetite for novelty and competition could express itself, this time through an invention that would, within another generation, transform the daily life of the entire country far more thoroughly than any dinner party or costume ball ever could. Let me tell you about Bailey's Beach for a moment, a small, unremarkable stretch of Newport coastline that became, through pure social engineering rather than any particular natural beauty, one of the most exclusive gathering places in the entire country. Access to this particular beach was restricted to members of a private club, membership itself governed by exactly the same closed, carefully policed logic that governed Mrs. Astor's ballroom, and being denied entry even briefly, even by accident, could constitute a genuine, lasting social wound. Guests bathed here in elaborate wool bathing costumes that covered nearly the entire body, an outfit that would strike a modern beachgoer as almost comically impractical for actual swimming, though of course actual swimming was never really the point. The point, as with so much else we have discussed tonight, was simply to be present, to be seen present, among the correct, carefully vetted company on a stretch of sand that had been transformed through sheer collective agreement into one more stage for this world's continuous, quiet performance of belonging. Nearby, the Newport Casino, despite its name, functioned not as a gambling establishment, but as an elegant social and athletic club, home to some of the earliest championship tennis tournaments held anywhere in the country, matches that drew the same fashionable crowd that filled the ballrooms each evening, watching now in daylight, in considerably lighter clothing, but with exactly the same practiced attentiveness to who was seated where and beside whom. Even leisure, even a supposedly relaxed afternoon at the beach, or an afternoon watching a tennis match, carried, in this particular world, the same quiet undercurrent of observation and evaluation that ran through absolutely everything else we have spent this evening exploring. There was in the end no true escape from the performance, no private corner of this world entirely free from the constant, watchful presence of everyone else equally engaged in exactly the same elaborate, unspoken competition. Portraiture deserves a mention too, because commissioning a formal painted portrait functioned, in this world, as another quiet but essential marker of arrival, a way of translating a family's newly acquired social standing into something permanent, hung on a wall, passed down through generations, granting an air of established legitimacy that a photograph, however fashionable, could never quite match. The most sought-after portrait painters of the era commanded genuinely enormous fees and maintained waiting lists stretching months or occasionally years, and a family fortunate enough to secure a sitting with one of the truly celebrated names understood that the resulting canvas would hang for decades afterward as visual proof of exactly how this family wished to be remembered. These portraits followed their own careful conventions. A woman might be painted in her finest gown, jewelry prominently displayed, posed against a background suggesting wealth and taste without appearing to try too hard at either, the particular skill of a truly gifted society portraitist lying precisely in his ability to flatter without appearing to flatter, to capture a sitter's genuine likeness while quietly, subtly improving on it in whatever small ways would please the client most. Some of the finest portraits from this era achieve a kind of psychological depth that transcends their original purely social function, capturing something genuinely alive and specific in their subject's expression, even while serving the entirely mundane commercial purpose of confirming, in oil and canvas, exactly where this particular family now stood in the world. Photography, arriving and rapidly improving across these same decades, offered a faster, more immediate alternative, and society photographers became genuine fixtures at the major balls and dinners we have discussed all evening, capturing images that would circulate in the newspapers the following morning, or occasionally be assembled into private albums, documenting a family's social calendar year by year. The famous photograph of the horseback dinner at Sherry's, the one still reproduced today whenever anyone wants a single image capturing the strangeness of this whole era, exists precisely because a professional photographer had been specifically hired for the evening, understanding correctly that an event this unusual deserved permanent visual documentation, that the story would need to be told again and again for decades afterward, and that a photograph would tell it more convincingly than any written account ever could. Some of this enormous private wealth did eventually flow into forms that have genuinely outlasted the parties and the gowns and the diamond dog collars, and I think it is worth spending a few minutes acknowledging that, before we bring tonight's story to its close, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, founded in the years just before the height of the era we have been discussing, grew substantially through the direct donations and bequests of exactly the families we have spent this evening following, men who had spent decades acquiring European paintings and sculpture and decorative arts for their own private galleries, eventually choosing in many cases to leave those same collections to the public rather than keeping them locked away for private enjoyment alone. One of the most significant collectors of the era, a formidable banker whose financial influence touched nearly every major American industry of his time, assembled a private art collection so vast and so significant that substantial portions of it, upon his death, became foundational holdings of several of the great American museums that still stand today, transforming what had once been a purely private, purely competitive impulse toward acquisition into something that millions of people who would never have been welcome inside his private gallery could eventually walk through freely for the price of admission alone. Libraries, too, benefited enormously from this same late flowering of philanthropic instinct. Public library systems across the entire country, in cities large and small, received funding from fortunes built during exactly this period, a specific, deliberate effort by some of these industrialists to convert wealth accumulated through railroads and steel and oil into something that would extend, in a very direct and practical way, into the lives of people who had never attended a single ball or received a single cotillion favor. It is a genuinely complicated legacy, worth holding with real nuance rather than simple judgment in either direction. The same men who built fortunes on labor conditions that by any modern standard would be considered genuinely brutal, who threw parties of an extravagance that helped provoke real justified public anger, also, in their final years and through their estates, built institutions that have quietly enriched the lives of ordinary Americans for well over a century since. Both of these things are true. Neither cancels out the other. History, when you actually look closely at it rather than settling for a simple story, is very rarely tidy enough to resolve itself into a single clean verdict, and this particular chapter of American history is no exception at all. Let me tell you briefly what eventually became of some of the women we have spent tonight getting to know, because I think their later lives add something genuinely worth knowing to everything we have already discussed. Alva Vanderbilt, the woman who forced open society's doors with that famous calling card standoff, and who later forced her own daughter into a marriage neither of them wanted, went on, in the second half of her life, to become a genuinely committed and effective campaigner for women's voting rights, funding suffrage organizations and hosting rallies at her own Newport mansion, applying exactly the same relentless, strategic energy she had once poured into ballroom politics toward a cause of real and lasting national significance. It is a strange, almost contradictory arc. The same woman who orchestrated her daughter's unhappy marriage, later fighting hard for women's basic political autonomy, and I do not think it resolves neatly into either redemption or hypocrisy. It simply sits there, complicated, the way most real human lives eventually do. Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose tearful wedding day we discussed at some length earlier tonight, eventually separated from the Duke of Marlborough, and after their marriage was formally annulled, she married again, this time to a French aviator and businessman by the name of Jacques Balsan, a union that, by every account she herself later gave, brought her the genuine happiness her first marriage never had. She lived a long life, remained active in philanthropic and humanitarian work across both Britain and France, and wrote her own memoirs late in life, offering a genuinely clear-eyed, occasionally quite critical account of the very world we have spent tonight exploring. A woman who had been raised inside the absolute center of Gilded Age extravagance, choosing, once she finally had the freedom to speak for herself, to describe that world with considerably more honesty than most of its willing participants ever managed. Caroline Astor, as we mentioned, died in 1908, her mind reportedly clouded in her final years by the kind of confusion that sometimes accompanies old age, and there is something quietly poignant in the accounts suggesting that, in those last months, she occasionally believed herself still to be hosting the great balls of her prime, greeting imaginary guests in an empty room, still, in her own mind, the undisputed monarch of a social world that had by then already begun quietly, irreversibly, moving on without her. Mamie Fish outlived her, continuing to entertain and to be entertaining well into the 1920s. watching the specific, unguarded style of extravagance she had helped define gradually give way to the faster, jazzier, more anxious parties of a new decade entirely, a world she had helped invent slowly becoming, even to her, something closer to nostalgia than to daily life. Let us go back, one final time, to the ballroom where our story properly began tonight, because it is time now to watch the evening close, slowly, the way these evenings always eventually closed, whatever spectacle had filled the hours before. By 3 in the morning, the orchestra has thinned its selections down to slower, gentler pieces, aware, in the practiced way musicians hired for this kind of work always seem to be aware, that the room's energy has shifted, that most of the guests remaining are no longer dancing with quite the same sharp, competitive attention they brought to the earlier hours of the evening. Maybe our young woman is tired now, genuinely tired. The particular ache that settles into the arches of the feet after hours in fine, unforgiving shoes, the small headache that gathers behind the eyes after hours of candlelight and gaslight, and the newer, harsher electric light all mixed together in one overheated room. Maybe she has danced every dance she was expected to dance, has spoken to every person she was expected to speak with, has performed, all evening long, exactly the particular version of herself this world requires from her, graceful, attentive, faintly amused, never once betraying the smallest hint of boredom or discomfort or genuine exhaustion, because betraying any of those things would itself constitute a small, quiet failure. Her husband finds her near one of the tall windows, where she has drifted, almost without noticing, toward the cooler air near the glass. Neither of them says very much. There is, by this late hour, a kind of comfortable, wordless understanding that passes between two people who have attended dozens of exactly these evenings together, who know, without needing to discuss it, precisely when it has become acceptable to begin making their goodbyes, precisely how long that process of goodbyes will itself take, moving slowly through the thinning crowd, a few final words here, a final compliment there, before finally, gratefully, reaching the front hall, where a servant is already waiting with their coats. The carriage ride home passes mostly in silence, the particular, comfortable silence of two people who have run entirely out of things that need saying out loud tonight. Through the window, the city looks different at this hour, emptier, quieter, the same gas lamps and electric lights that seemed so glamorous a few hours earlier now simply doing their ordinary practical work of illuminating largely deserted streets. A milk cart passes them at one intersection, the driver already beginning his own workday just as theirs is finally properly ending, two entirely different rhythms of the same city briefly crossing paths and then separating again, each continuing on toward their own version of morning. Back at the house, the front hall is dim, lit by a single lamp left burning for their return. A member of the household staff, perhaps the very maid who helped her dress so many hours earlier, is still awake, still working, ready to help her out of the gown and the jewelry and the careful architecture of pins holding her hair in place, undoing, piece by piece, in reverse, everything that took the better part of an hour to construct at the start of the evening. There is no need to describe that unwinding in full again here. We have already watched, once tonight, how carefully a woman in this world is assembled before an evening like this one. Watching it come apart, at the very end, in the quiet hours before dawn, requires only the simple observation that undoing always takes less time than building, and that by the time the last pin is finally set aside on the dressing table, she is, for the first time since early that evening, genuinely, completely herself again, with no one left to perform for at all. She sits for a moment at her dressing table before finally climbing into bed, looking at her own reflection in the same mirror that greeted her hours earlier, though the face looking back at her now carries a different weight than it did before the evening began, something closer to relief, or perhaps simply exhaustion, or perhaps, on a good night, something closer to genuine, private satisfaction, the quiet, specific pleasure of an evening well managed, a role well performed, a small private victory that no newspaper account the following morning will ever quite manage to capture correctly, because the newspaper will only ever see the dress and the jewels and the guest list, never the particular personal cost of holding herself so perfectly, so consistently, across so many continuous hours. Outside, The sky over the city is just beginning, faintly, to lighten toward grey, that particular pre-dawn hour when the night has not yet fully released its grip, but the darkness has already started, almost imperceptibly, to thin. Somewhere across the same city, in rooms considerably smaller and considerably less carefully appointed than the one where she now lies drifting towards sleep, an entire different population is already stirring. Bakers beginning their ovens, dock workers rising in cold tenement rooms to walk toward another long day of physical labor, the enormous, largely invisible machinery of the city's ordinary working life beginning to turn over again, exactly as it does every single morning, regardless of whatever spectacle had filled some Fifth Avenue ballroom the night before. She does not think about any of this. Not really, not tonight. Why would she? It is not cruelty exactly, this particular blindness, so much as simple structural distance, the same distance that let a woman worry, with genuine sincerity, that spending $400,000 on a single costume ball might actually help stimulate the economy, because the mechanics of how money and labor and hardship actually connected to one another in the lives of people she would never meet existed almost entirely outside her field of vision, filtered, if it appeared at all, through occasional newspaper accounts or the carefully managed distance of organized charity work. And yet, I think it would be too simple, too easy, to end tonight's story purely on that note of quiet condemnation, because underneath everything we have discussed this evening, underneath the dogs and the diamonds and the horses climbing 4 floors to eat dinner indoors, there is something recognizably universally human running through all of it. The specific hunger for novelty that drove a hostess to keep reaching for stranger and stranger spectacles. The quiet exhaustion of performing a role so consistently that the performance eventually starts to feel indistinguishable from an actual self. The complicated, sometimes contradictory arc of a life, an Alva Vanderbilt who could force her own daughter into misery and later fight genuinely, effectively for other women's freedom. None of that is unique to the 1890s. None of that belongs only to the very wealthy. It simply appears in this particular story, magnified to an almost cartoonish scale by an amount of money that had by any reasonable measure stopped serving any practical purpose at all, and had become instead pure raw material for entertainment, for boredom, for the same restless, universal human need to feel, even briefly, even artificially, that tonight was somehow different from every other night that came before it. There is one more thread worth pulling before we finally let this story rest, because it connects directly to that quiet exhaustion we just touched on, and because it was, in its own strange way, a genuine medical phenomenon of the era, documented by real physicians, discussed in real medical journals. Doctors of this period had identified and given a formal name to a condition they called nervous exhaustion, sometimes referred to by the more clinical term neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis applied with startling frequency to wealthy women who presented with fatigue, headaches, a kind of pervasive low-grade despair that no obvious physical illness seemed to explain. The prescribed treatment, developed by a physician named Silas Weir Mitchell and adopted widely across fashionable medical practice, was called the rest cure, and it involved in its strictest form weeks of near total bed rest, isolation from ordinary responsibilities, a rich, fattening diet, and a deliberate, almost total withdrawal from exactly the kind of intellectual and social stimulation that had, ironically, filled these women's lives to overflowing in the first place. Some women found genuine, if temporary, relief in this enforced withdrawal, a rare, sanctioned excuse to simply stop performing, for a few weeks, the endless, exhausting choreography of calls and dinners and balls we have spent this entire evening exploring. Others found the treatment itself its own kind of quiet torment, an infantilizing isolation that at least one woman later documented in her own writing pushed her considerably closer to genuine breakdown than any of her original symptoms ever had. I find this detail worth sitting with at the very end of tonight's story, because it suggests something true underneath everything we have discussed this evening. This world, for all its glittering abundance, for all its diamonds and its dogs and its horses climbing 4 floors to eat indoors, was also quietly making a certain number of the women living inside it genuinely unwell, in ways their own doctors could name but could not always properly explain, let alone properly treat. The performance we have followed all night long, the perfect posture, the perfect composure, the perfect refusal to ever let exhaustion or boredom or genuine unhappiness show on a carefully arranged face, came, for at least some of the women required to sustain it, at a real and measurable cost, one that resort towns and rest cures and fashionable doctors could soothe, sometimes, but never entirely resolve, because the underlying structure producing that exhaustion, the relentless, unbroken requirement to always appear serenely, effortlessly fine, was never really the thing any doctor's prescription was actually equipped to change. Let us return, finally, one last time, to the quiet room where we have left our young woman sleeping, because I think it is the right place to close tonight's story. The house around her has gone fully silent now. The last of the household staff finally, briefly permitted their own few hours of rest before the ordinary work of the coming day begins again. Outside, the sky has continued its slow, patient shift from grey towards something closer to the pale gold of early morning, the specific quality of light that arrives just before a city fully wakes, when the streets still belong, for a little while longer, only to the earliest workers and the last of the night's carriages making their way home. She sleeps, I think, without dreaming of dogs or diamonds or Versailles ballrooms recreated in a rented restaurant. She sleeps, most likely, the way anyone sleeps after a long, demanding evening, simply and completely, her body finally allowed to stop performing the particular, practiced grace this world required of her every single day. Tomorrow, or really later this same day, there will be calls to make, invitations to answer, perhaps a fitting for the next gown already being constructed for whatever evening comes after this one. The whole intricate, glittering machine we have spent tonight exploring will simply continue turning exactly as it has turned for years, exactly as it will continue turning for a while longer yet, until the slow accumulation of everything we discussed toward the end of tonight's story, the income tax, the war, the death of the woman who once held the entire structure together through sheer force of personal will, finally brings this particular version of the machine to its quiet, gradual close. But that ending is still some years away yet from where she is sleeping tonight. Tonight, there is simply rest, earned rest, the particular, bone-deep tiredness of a woman who has spent an entire evening being watched, being judged, being gracious, being exactly, precisely correct in every visible detail, and who has finally, blessedly, been allowed to stop. I want to leave you with one final thought before we let this whole glittering, strange world finally settle into rest tonight, because I think it is the thought that has been sitting quietly underneath everything we have discussed this evening, waiting for a chance to surface properly. Every single spectacle we have walked through tonight, the dogs in diamond collars, the horses eating dinner 4 floors above the street, the entire Palace of Versailles rebuilt inside a rented restaurant for a single evening, shares one underlying, recognizably human root, and it has almost nothing to do with money itself, however much money happened to be involved in the execution. It is the simple, universal desire to feel that tonight matters, that this particular evening will be remembered, that a life spent moving through an endless, comfortable, unchallenging succession of identical days might occasionally contain one evening genuinely worth talking about afterward. Most of us, most people across most of human history have satisfied that particular hunger through far smaller, far more modest means. A good meal shared with people we love, a celebration marking some genuine milestone, a night that felt special because of who was there rather than what it cost. The families we have spent tonight following had access to a scale of resource so enormous that the modest, ordinary sources of that same feeling had simply stopped registering for them at all. An excellent dinner was no longer remarkable, a beautiful house was no longer remarkable, and so the search for that same simple, universal feeling of specialness pushed further and further outward, towards stranger and stranger territory, until it eventually arrived at genuinely bizarre places. A monkey seated at the head of a formal dinner table, an elephant fed peanuts in a Manhattan drawing room, purely because ordinary abundance could no longer produce the particular spark these evenings were actually, underneath everything, chasing. There is something worth carrying with you from that observation, I think, something that has nothing at all to do with dogs or diamonds or the specific historical details of 1890s New York. The feeling these families were chasing so relentlessly, so expensively, across all these strange and elaborate evenings, was never actually for sale. Not really. Not even at the scale of wealth we have spent tonight exploring. It could be temporarily, expensively simulated for a single glittering evening at a time, but it could never be permanently purchased, never definitively resolved, which is precisely why the parties had to keep escalating, evening after evening, decade after decade, each one needing to be slightly stranger than the last, simply to produce the same fleeting, familiar spark. The genuine version of that feeling, the quiet, durable sense that a particular evening, a particular life actually mattered, tends, if you look honestly at the accounts these families themselves eventually left behind, to have come from far smaller, far more ordinary places after all. A real friendship, honestly held, rather than a rivalry carefully performed. A quiet hour with someone who did not require a single moment of performance from you at all. The things, in other words, that money in this particular story never actually managed to buy, however hard, however inventively, however extravagantly, it kept on trying. Before we let the story rest completely, I want to go back and tell you the full version of that monkey dinner we mentioned earlier tonight, because the details, once you know them properly, are even better than the brief version suggested, and I think they deserve a proper telling. The scheme began, as these things so often did in Mamie Fish's world, as a private joke between her and Harry Lehr, the same cotillion-leading, gleefully theatrical bachelor who had co-hosted the dog birthday party we discussed at length earlier. Mamie had recently acquired a new pet, a small monkey she had affectionately named Jocko, and somewhere between Newport's harbour and her own front door, an idea took shape. She let word spread quietly through her social circle that a foreign dignitary would soon be arriving in Newport, a prince, supposedly travelling from Corsica, of a distinguished but slightly obscure noble family called Del Drago. Harry Lehr, playing along beautifully, added convincing little details whenever anyone asked after the mysterious visitor, warning acquaintances that the prince could be somewhat unpredictable after a few drinks, mentioning offhand that he belonged to a more distant branch of a family Newport's residents vaguely recognized. The unmarried women of the summer colony, by every surviving account, took the bait completely, practicing their curtsies, powdering their faces, genuinely hoping to catch the eye of this eligible, mysterious foreign nobleman everyone was suddenly breathlessly discussing. On the appointed evening, a wealthy young Chicago man walked into Marmie's Newport mansion with the prince, as promised, in hand. Quite literally in hand, because Prince Del Drago turned out to be Jocko himself, dressed, courtesy of a Newport tailor Mamie had simply refused to accept a no from, in a small, perfectly tailored set of formal evening clothes. The room, according to the accounts that survive, dissolved instantly into a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and eventually genuine helpless laughter, while Mamie Fish and Harry Lehr stood off to the side, by all reports thoroughly delighted with themselves, having spent real money and real effort orchestrating an elaborate practical joke purely for the pleasure of watching an entire room of sophisticated, socially anxious people make complete fools of themselves over a household pet in a tiny tuxedo. I think this fuller version of the story tells us something the shorter version missed. This was never really about the monkey at all. It was about Mamie's particular, specific genius for exploiting exactly the anxieties this entire world ran on, the desperate hunger for social advancement, the eagerness to impress anyone who might carry genuine status, however thin the actual evidence for that status turned out to be. She had, in effect, built an elaborate trap out of her own society's deepest insecurities, and watched with evident delight as everyone walked directly into it. Mamie Fish had one more party up her sleeve that deserves mention, stranger in its own quiet way than either the dogs or the monkey, because this one required no animals at all, only the willing participation of several dozen supremely wealthy, supremely dignified adults. She once hosted an evening built entirely around the theme of infancy, instructing her guests to dress as oversized dolls and to speak, for the duration of the party, exclusively in baby talk, grown men and women, some of the most powerful and socially prominent people in the entire country, cooing and babbling at each other across a beautifully appointed dinner table, high chairs reportedly arranged for at least some of the guests, the entire elaborate machinery of formal high society entertainment turned, for one single evening, toward deliberately, gleefully infantile nonsense. I want to pause on this one for a moment, because I think it might be the single clearest illustration in this entire evening's worth of stories of just how completely boredom had hollowed out the ordinary meaning of adult social ritual for this particular circle of people. Formal dinners, with their assigned seating and their 14 courses and their carefully rehearsed conversation, had become so exhaustively familiar, so completely mastered, that the only remaining source of genuine surprise left available to a hostess of Mamie Fisher's ambition was to strip all of that hard-won formality away entirely and replace it with its exact opposite: dignified adults reduced, by their own hostess's explicit instruction, to babbling nonsense in high chairs. It reads, from this distance, almost like satire, a wealthy woman quietly, pointedly mocking the very rituals of formal adult society that had made her own social position possible in the first place, even while she continued, evening after evening, to depend on those same rituals for her continued relevance. Harry Lair himself, the co-conspirator behind so many of these evenings, is worth a final word before we close, because his own story adds one more layer of genuine strangeness to everything we have discussed tonight. He had arrived in New York society from a family with neither great wealth nor great social standing, and had built his entire position, his entire livelihood really, purely on charm, wit, and an evidently bottomless talent for making wealthy, bored people laugh. Society eventually crowned him with a nickname, King Lair, and he spent decades as one of the single most sought-after guests and hosts in this entire glittering world. A man who had in effect turned entertainment itself into a genuine profession, decades before anyone would have used a word like that to describe what he actually did for a living. I want to tell you, before we finally close the door on tonight's story, what eventually happened to the houses themselves, because I think their fate carries its own quiet, fitting kind of poetry. Most of the great Fifth Avenue mansions we discussed earlier tonight, the chateaux and the palazzos standing shoulder to shoulder along that once impossibly fashionable stretch of street, did not survive terribly long past the era that built them. As the 20th century progressed, as commercial real estate values along Fifth Avenue climbed higher and higher, and as the families themselves gradually dispersed, moved uptown, moved to apartments, moved on to other cities entirely, one grand private mansion after another was quietly sold, and very often demolished, replaced by department stores, office buildings, eventually skyscrapers, so that almost nothing physically remains today of that specific, concentrated stretch of private palaces we spent part of tonight walking through. A person standing on that same section of Fifth Avenue now would see glass towers and luxury retail, with only the smallest scattering of surviving structures and the occasional historical marker to suggest that an entire vanished world of dogs in diamond collars and horses eating dinner indoors had ever stood on that exact same ground. Newport fared rather differently, and I think it is worth ending on this particular detail, because it offers something closer to a genuinely gentle conclusion. Many of the great Newport cottages, Marble House and the breakers among them, survived largely intact, in part because Newport itself gradually lost its position as the absolute center of fashionable summer life, which meant there was less commercial pressure to tear the old houses down and build something new in their place. Eventually, decades later, many of these same houses were acquired by a historical preservation society and opened to the public, so that today, for the price of an ordinary museum ticket, absolutely anyone, regardless of their own family's history or fortune, can walk through the same marble hallways where Alva Vanderbilt once hosted her costume balls, can stand in the same dining rooms where 14-course dinners were once served to guests who would never have imagined an ordinary visitor from any background simply walking in through the front door. There is something worth sitting with in that final image, I think, as we bring tonight's story to its close. A world built almost entirely around exclusion, around the careful, deliberate policing of exactly who belonged and who did not, around locked doors and calling cards and closely guarded guest lists, eventually, through nothing more dramatic than the simple passage of enough time, opened itself completely to absolutely everyone, indiscriminately, for the cost of a ticket. The dogs are gone, the horses are gone, The diamonds have long since been sold or inherited or scattered across 100 different collections, but the rooms themselves remain patient and quiet, waiting now for an entirely different, far more ordinary kind of visitor than they were ever originally built to receive. There is one final piece of this story worth telling before we close, because it explains how a world this small, this deliberately closed off, managed to shape the imagination of an entire country that would never once be invited through its front doors. Ordinary Americans could not attend the Bradley Martin Ball or dine on horseback at Sherry's, obviously, but they could read about both in exhaustive detail the following morning, and a genuine industry grew up specifically to sell them some small, affordable echo of that world for themselves. Department stores, a genuinely new kind of retail institution taking shape in these same decades, built entire window displays around the latest fashions worn at the season's most talked-about balls, translating a Worth original, worn once by a woman whose family owned half a railroad, into a mass-produced approximation that a shop clerk or a schoolteacher might actually be able to afford on her own modest wages. Mail-order catalogues, reaching into farmhouses and small towns across the entire country, offered their own simplified versions of the same silhouettes appearing in the society pages. Corsets and gowns and hats, styled after whatever New York's wealthiest women happened to be wearing that particular season, arriving by post to women who had lived their entire lives without ever once glimpsing an actual ballroom on Fifth Avenue. An illustrator named Charles Dana Gibson created a single, idealized image of American womanhood during exactly this period, tall, elegant, effortlessly fashionable, that came to be known simply as the Gibson Girl, and that image, appearing on everything from magazine covers to advertisements to popular songs, offered millions of ordinary women a kind of aspirational blueprint, a version of grace and style borrowed loosely from the wealthy world we have spent tonight exploring, but scaled down, softened, made available, at least in its outward appearance, to almost anyone willing to save for it. I think there is something worth noticing in this particular chain of influence, stretching all the way from a Newport ballroom down to a farmhouse mailbox in some small town 1,000 miles away. The extravagance itself remained entirely, permanently out of reach for the overwhelming majority of the people fascinated by it, but the aesthetic, the general shape and posture and style of that extravagance, filtered down, diluted and simplified at every step until it eventually touched nearly everyone in one small way or another, whether or not they ever fully understood exactly where that particular silhouette, that particular idea of elegance had originally come from. And that same distant fascination, over time, curdled gradually into something closer to organized anger, and it is worth spending a few final minutes on the writers who helped that shift take shape, because they represent the last piece of this puzzle we have not yet properly discussed. A new generation of journalists, working in the first years of the 1900s, began publishing detailed, carefully researched exposés of exactly how fortunes like the ones we have discussed all evening had actually been assembled, the labor conditions inside the steel mills and the railroad yards, the political corruption required to secure favorable regulation, the specific mechanics by which a small handful of families had come to control such an enormous share of the nation's total wealth. President Theodore Roosevelt himself gave this entire school of journalism its lasting name, comparing these reporters, not entirely as a compliment, to a figure in an old English allegory so fixated on raking through muck that he never once looked up to notice anything finer happening around him. The muckrakers, as the name stuck and became a badge of honor rather than an insult, produced a steady stream of popular magazine articles and books throughout the early 1900s that did more than any single ball or dinner ever could to change how ordinary Americans understood the relationship between the extravagance we have spent tonight discussing and the working conditions that had actually financed it. Their work fed directly into a broader political movement of the era, generally remembered now as the progressive movement, which pushed, with real and eventually substantial success, for exactly the kinds of structural change that the world of Mrs. Astor and the Vanderbilts had spent decades successfully avoiding: stronger regulation of large corporations, improved labor protections, the eventual introduction of that federal income tax we discussed earlier, food and drug safety standards, responding directly to the same kind of investigative reporting that had exposed conditions inside the meatpacking industry. None of this reform happened quickly, and none of it happened without fierce, well-funded resistance from the very families whose fortunes stood to be affected. But it happened gradually, steadily, across the first 2 decades of the new century, and by the time the 1920s arrived, the specific legal and political environment that had allowed fortunes on the scale of the Vanderbilts or the Astors to accumulate with almost no structural check at all had been meaningfully, permanently altered. Before we finally close, I want to give a brief, honest nod to the people who made every single one of tonight's stories physically possible, because it would feel wrong to end an entire evening about Gilded Age entertainment without at least acknowledging them directly, even briefly, even though their own daily lives are not the subject we set out to explore tonight. Behind every dinner for 100 dogs stood a kitchen staff who had spent the entire day preparing 2 completely separate menus, one for the animals and one for their owners, with exactly the same care and exactly the same professional pride either way. Behind every gown worn once and retired stood seamstresses who might spend weeks of close, careful, eye-straining labor on a single garment, for wages that bore almost no relationship to the value of what they had actually produced. Behind every horse that climbed 4 floors in a freight elevator to eat dinner in a ballroom stood grooms and stable hands who had spent the preceding days calming and preparing animals for an experience no horse would ever naturally choose for itself, standing quietly at each horse's head throughout an entire strange evening to make sure nothing went wrong. These men and women rarely appear by name in any of the newspaper accounts we have drawn from tonight, and that absence is itself worth noticing one final time before we let this whole story finally rest. The spectacle was always, by design, meant to look effortless, and effortlessness, in a world built on this scale of wealth, was never actually free. It was manufactured continuously, invisibly, by an enormous population of working people whose own evenings, whatever they contained nothing remotely like what they spent their days making possible for someone else. And perhaps that is the truest measure of the whole era we have spent tonight exploring, more accurate, in the end, than any single dollar figure or any single guest list. A world this spectacular required an entire hidden second world to sustain it, a world of hands and hours and quiet, unglamorous skill running continuously underneath every single evening's worth of dazzling, effortless-seeming display. The 2 worlds shared the same streets, sometimes the very same rooms, and yet they moved through those spaces according to 2 entirely separate sets of rules, 2 entirely separate rhythms of exhaustion and rest, 2 entirely separate understandings of what an evening was even for. We have spent tonight almost entirely inside one of those worlds, because that is the story I promised you when we began, the strange, glittering, occasionally absurd amusements of the very rich. But it felt important, before letting the lights go all the way down, to at least gesture once toward everything standing quietly outside that particular circle of candlelight, holding it all up, unseen, unnamed, and largely unremembered. That gesture made, that debt at least briefly acknowledged, I think we can finally, properly let the evening close. It is a strange thing, looking back across everything we have covered tonight, to realize how much of it comes down, in the end, to a handful of people, a small, tightly interconnected circle of families who happen to occupy exactly the right moment in American history to accumulate wealth on a scale the country had genuinely never seen before, and who then spent decades figuring out, through trial and error and open competition with each other, exactly what a person does with that much money once every practical need has already been thoroughly, permanently satisfied. Some of what they built still stands, most of it does not. The dogs are long gone, the horses are long gone, even the particular shade of unguarded, unapologetic confidence that let a hostess seat 100 jeweled dogs at her own dinner table without a flicker of self-doubt belongs now entirely to the past, preserved only in old photographs and old newspaper columns and stories like the one we have spent tonight telling together. So that is where we leave it tonight, in a quiet, sleeping house on a street that no longer exists in quite the way it once did, beside a young woman who spent an entire evening being watched, and who is now, finally, simply resting, unwatched, unhurried, her particular version of this strange, glittering, unequal world continuing on around her while she sleeps through the first pale hours of a morning she will not properly wake into for several hours yet. We have travelled a long way together tonight, through ballrooms and dinner tables and horseback rides 4 floors above a city street, through diamond collars and Versailles reconstructed in a rented restaurant, through the quiet exhaustion sitting underneath so much of that glittering surface, and through the strange, patient way that even the most carefully guarded, most deliberately exclusive world eventually, given enough time, opens itself up entirely. If any part of tonight's story has stayed with you, some small detail, the swans nearly fighting on a dinner table, the horses climbing a freight elevator in full evening dress, the monkey in his tiny tailored suit, I hope it settles gently now, the way these things tend to settle when the lights are low and the evening has gone on long enough that thinking itself starts to soften at the edges. There is no test at the end of a story like this one. There is only the story itself and the quiet and whatever pleasant drifting thoughts it happens to leave behind as you finally let go of the day. Wherever you are tonight, however far from Fifth Avenue or Newport or any ballroom at all, I hope you are warm and comfortable and ready now to simply close your eyes and let the rest of this night take care of itself. Thank you for spending these hours with me. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time, whenever you are ready for another story. Good night.